Chapter 396. The word moon had always existed in this world, such as the Ueluan kingdom, the famous laurel in the Ueluan kingdom, and the white color of the moon, which was derived from the color of the laurel petals. However, the word moon in this world had no specific meaning. It was as vague as light and muddy. Of course, the headmaster was not referring to the color of the moon, because he was asking about the moon. Because of this question, Ninkei suddenly became nervous. According to his usual style, he would definitely try his best to play dumb at this moment. However, if he played dumb now, he would really be a fool. Because the headmaster had already pointed out that he was a person who was born with knowledge. Ninkei lowered his head and felt the cold sweat flowing down his back, gradually wetting his clothes. After a long silence, he said in a trembling voice, "The sun and the moon rotate, and light and darkness are opposite. I think that the moon might be something that corresponds to the sun. The sun appears in the day, and the moon appears in the night." The headmaster said, "Be more specific." Ninkei looked at the cliff in front of him, at the flowing clouds under the starlight, and fell into a long silence again. Then he said it might be a huge stone ball floating in the night sky. Because it can reflect the light of the sun, it appears very bright at night. He could not explain why he could describe the moon that did not exist in this world. The headmaster looked at him and smiled. He helped him to give an explanation that might not be reasonable, but at least it was reasonable. "It seems that what you saw in your dream was very interesting." Hearing the word dream, Ninkei looked up at the headmaster who was standing by the cliff. He looked at the headmaster's clothes dancing in the night wind, and vaguely seemed to catch something. "This idea is indeed very interesting." The headmaster turned to look at the night sky and said admiringly, "The eternal night always needs some light. Everything in the world corresponds to each other. If the sun appears in the day, it is not bad to have a corresponding moon. But if there is a moon, where would it be? If the moon reflects the light of the sun as you said, doesn't that mean that the sun is also in our world at night but we can't see it? Then where is the sun at night? Is it really like when the west moves and the mountains set, falling below our feet, and then rising again in the morning? Doesn't that mean the sun is revolving around our world? But the world we live in is a flat and open land, and the edge is an endless abyss. Why did I wait for more than 10 days but I didn't see the sun set into the abyss, and it just disappeared so suddenly?" The headmaster looked at the night sky with his hands behind his back and murmured to himself. He was not talking to Ninkei, but to himself, who had been searching for the answer for countless years. After a while, he looked at Chang and city in the distant wilderness and said with a frown, "There are still many places that are impassable. If this world were a ball, it would be connected." People in the secular world were used to the sun rising in the east and setting in the west. They were used to being shrouded in the radiance of Haotian day after day, just like they were used to the breakfast stalls on the street and the moss on the edge of the well. They never had any questions about these things, let alone wondered why these things existed. But the headmaster was not a person of the secular world. He needed to think. Few people in the world could understand what he was mumbling to himself. Those who heard it would even think that the headmaster was a crazy old man. Ninkei understood some of it. He was a little confused, but then he admired the headmaster. The headmaster obviously had no knowledge of astronomy. He was about to touch the truth of the world just by following Ninkei's simple explanation. However, the truth did not belong to this world but another world. He did not know that the other world existed in the distant past but in the future. "I have looked at this night sky for many years." The headmaster pointed at the high and dark sky above the cliff and the stars hanging in the sky. He said, whether it was many years ago or many years later, the stars have always stayed in their original positions and have not changed at all. This means that the relative positions of the earth and the sky are fixed. This stability is filled with a classical and solemn eternal beauty. But it is a little boring after looking at it for a long time. Ninkei looked at the night sky along his teacher's arm. He did not know what the headmaster was trying to say. But since the beginning of the Tianqi era, the stars in the night sky have been getting dimmer day by day. Mortals can't see the difference, but I know they are getting dimmer. The headmaster said, "There was one time when the darkening process was seen by the officials of the imperial astronomer. That was why there was the comment, 'The stars are covered by the night sky.' and the country will not be peaceful. Ning Ke knew that it was this comment from the imperial astronomer that caused the Tang Empire to fall into a dispute. It indirectly caused Li Yu to marry into the grassland a few years later. However, he only knew that the comment was true after hearing the headmaster's words today. At least the first half of the sentence was true. It turned out that the stars in the night sky were really getting dimmer. How could it be a matter of the country not being peaceful? The headmaster laughed. Ning Ke's mood was slightly relaxed. He did not expect the headmaster to continue. If the whole world has entered the eternal night, how could the Tang Empire not be the only country that is not peaceful? Thinking of the sentences in the Ming handscroll that were similar to prophecy and some legends, Ning Ke could not control the nervousness and fear in his heart. He asked, "Teacher, is there really an underworld invasion?" The headmaster said, "The Ming handscroll of the tomes of arcane foretold the arrival of the night. There are also related legends in the West Hill teachings and the ancient volumes of the Buddhism sect. Because of these prophecies and legends, many wise men have thought about it for countless years. 1,000 years ago, the divine priest of light went to the wilderness to preach, but he founded the devil's doctrine. The Buddhism sect's temples stayed in the deep mountains and did not move. It is probably related to this. As for whether the legends are true or not, no one knows." Ning Ke asked, "Teacher, you don't know either? I have said that there is no omniscient person in the world. Even those who are born with knowledge can only know the things that they have seen in their dreams. If they have not seen it, they still don't know." Ning Ke did not speak. The headmaster looked at the night sky above his head. After a moment of silence, he said, "In the past 2 years, your eldest brother and I have traveled in the world. We went to the cold region of the far north and found that the night there has obviously become much longer. The hot sea has even gradually become cold. That is why the desolate was forced to break the promise of 1,000 years and take the risk to return to the south." Ning Ke had heard of the legend of the underworld. Most people in the market knew about this legend. However, a legend was a legend after all. In addition, the West Hill Divine Palace had always been indifferent to this kind of legend, so the legend became increasingly illusory. However, the headmaster himself was a legendary figure. When the legend of the underworld came out of his solemn mouth, and there seemed to be some vague evidence, then the legend was probably true. Ning Ke felt cold, and the back of his wet clothes seemed to be frozen. No one noticed that even the winter in Chang and last year was colder than the year before. Of course, this may be an accident. Until now, I still think that the underworld invasion is only a story used to scare children. Because no one has discovered the underworld, including me. The headmaster looked at Ning Ke's slightly pale face and comforted him. And even if the eternal night comes, according to the records in the Ming handscroll and the ancient Buddhism sect volumes, it can't be a very short process. It must be extremely long. Maybe 100 years, 1,000 years, or even 10,000 years. What does it have to do with people like us? Ning Ke said sadly, "Headmaster is lying again. If you really don't believe in the story of the underworld invasion, why would you look for the underworld everywhere? And why would it take 10,000 years? Then tell me, where is the underworld?" The headmaster looked at Ning Ke with a smile. His smile seemed to hide an incomparably rich meaning. He asked, "Or, in your dreams, which direction is the underworld in the world?" Ning Ke felt the headmaster's gaze and thought of the bizarre story of his own life by the great divine priest of light. The cold sweat on his clothes instantly disappeared without a trace. Was he really the son of Yama? Did the headmaster already know that he was the son of Yama? Ning Ke couldn't accept this because he didn't know what Yama was, and he clearly knew where he came from. If this was true and he was really the legendary son of Yama, then the bloody storm that the West Hill Divine Palace set off in Chang, and back then seemed to have some kind of reason. And he hated this kind of reason even if it was unreasonable. Looking at his anxious expression, the headmaster smiled and said, "When people think, Hao Yin always laughs. If the underworld really exists and will invade the human world, that is something that the supreme way of heaven needs to consider and is qualified to consider. As a child, what can you do? What can you change? If you can't do anything, then what's the point of you being so painful and anxious?" Ning Ke didn't agree with the headmaster's attitude. Thinking of the scene of eldest brother understanding the Tao in the morning and entering the Tao in the evening, He thought that it was okay for him to understand the Tao in the morning and die in the evening. Even if he couldn't change the final ending of the world and might not even see it, he could live happily with Sang Sang in the human world until his hair turned white. But anyone who could think would always want to know what was the end of time and why all this happened. However, since the headmaster didn't want to discuss this matter anymore, especially with him, no matter how he asked, he wouldn't say a word. Ning Ke lowered his head and kept silent for a long time. Suddenly, he raised his head and looked at the headmaster. He asked seriously, "Then teacher, please tell me how youngest uncle died." Then he added, "This matter is meaningful to me." He knew that this matter was indeed meaningful to Ning Ke because he was now walking on the path that youngest uncle had walked, and he wanted to change the ending of this story. This is the first chapter. The second chapter will come out before 11:30. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 397. The headmaster asked, "Have you ever thought about what kind of existence Heaven's Way is?" Ning Ke thought for a while. He really had no concept of the heavenly way, which was an illusory existence. "No. Didn't you just say that Haotian is always laughing when people are thinking? But sometimes, even if we are ridiculed, we still have to think. If a baby falls down on his first step and is ridiculed by others, then he will never try again, then he will never be able to walk again. If you learn calligraphy and the first character you write is too ugly, then you will never become the current Honorable Ning. Teacher, I think you are making fun of me now," Ning Ke said with a smile. He thought of how he had been searching for a way to cultivate for many years. He was also laughed at by people in the city of Wei when he was reading the article on the response of the Tao. But he did not give up and finally got to where he was today. Then he thought of his and Song Song's miserable life and confirmed that his view was correct. Then heaven definitely did not have a pair of eyes that always looked down on the joys and sorrows of the human world, because fate was not fair to people. So he answered after thinking for a while, "Heaven's Way is a very empty existence." The headmaster was satisfied with his answer and said, "We don't know whether Haotian is alive or not. We don't know whether he has a specific form or not. We still don't know where Haotian is. But younger brother confirmed whether he has consciousness or not at the cost of his death." The chilly night wind rolled up the drifting clouds at the foot of the cliff, carrying with it the damp and cold water vapor. The clouds crashed into the precipice and then dispersed in all directions, gradually spreading to the cliff plateau, adding a bit of coolness to the atmosphere. The headmaster looked up at the high and cold sky and said slowly, "If Heaven's Way really exists and it looks down on the world, those people who are struggling to survive on the earth and even those cultivators who seem to be able to summon wind and rain are just like ants. If the heavenly axiom does exist, it won't show the slightest mercy or attention to ants at all. When some of the ants suddenly raise their heads to look at it and even begin to grow wings that are as thin as feathers and fly to the sky, trying to challenge it, how can its consciousness and will allow that to happen? If Heaven's Way really exists, it will be invisible and even more ruthless." Ning Ke looked at his teacher, who was standing on the edge of the cliff like an immortal in the night wind. He thought about the 3 consecutive sentences of, "If there really is Heaven's Way." After a long silence, he suddenly said firmly, "But teacher, you are not an ant." The headmaster laughed loudly. His laughter was full of grandeur. The laughter suddenly rose from the edge of the cliff and pierced the high and cold night sky. The sea of clouds between the cliffs was terrified and turbulent. It was not until the laughter of the headmaster gradually faded away that the clouds returned to calmness. The headmaster stood at the edge of the cliff and looked at the stars and clouds. After a long silence, he suddenly sighed and said, "It's a pity that there are no bugs." The Korean tiger chicken was the simplest form of drinking, but Ning Ke knew that the headmaster did not say it because he wanted to drink. He thought that this simple or even superficial description must be the headmaster's understanding of Haotian in this life. However, he could not understand the deep meaning of the phrase. The headmaster's previous words solved some of the doubts in his heart, but also gave birth to some new doubts. If youngest uncle was the ant that grew wings and wanted to fly to the sky, he would be punished by heaven because he offended the dignity of Heaven's Way. Then why did he do that? There were billions of ants in the world, and there must have been more than one that raised its head and looked at the sky. In the long years, there must have been many people that tried to fly to the clear blue sky. Where did those people go? Did they die heroically like youngest uncle? Or did they return to the embrace of Haotian and enter the perfect eternity like the stories of immortalization recorded in the West Hill scriptures? If youngest uncle's state did not allow him to stay in the world, then why did he choose to challenge heaven's way instead of entering eternity? Was it just because of pride? But no matter how fierce and proud a tiger was, it would not roar at a hunter's whistle for no reason. There was another question. Why did the headmaster still stay in the world? Where did the headmaster keep his wings? Did the headmaster not want to see the true appearance of heaven's way? He looked at the headmaster at the edge of the cliff and said, "Teacher, there are still many things that I don't understand." The headmaster said, "When you fully understand the third book, you will probably understand." Ning-Ke knew that it was not something that could be done in a short period of time. After a moment of silence, he got rid of the atmosphere of this mysterious conversation and returned to the real world. He sincerely asked, "The Great Spirit in my body can disguise as the aura of heaven and earth, but it is not easy to cover up my body. If I let someone's weapon fall on my body, Haotian Taoism will definitely find out that something is wrong." The headmaster said, "Didn't you ask someone to spread the word that you are cultivating in both talisman and martial arts?" Ning-Ke smiled awkwardly and said, "How can I deceive people in the cultivation of martial arts?" The headmaster said mockingly, "In cultivation, as long as you can beat people, you can naturally deceive them. Don't let people hurt your body. Who will know about the strangeness of your body?" Ning-Ke was silent. He thought that the battle between cultivators was unpredictable and dangerous. Even if he had improved a lot, how could he ensure that his opponent's natal sword would not touch his body? Even Yi Hongyu, the Tao addict, would not dare to boast like that. The headmaster looked into his eyes and said after a moment of silence, "After younger brother left this cliff cave, he did not let anyone touch his body until the day he died." The headmaster left the cliff plateau. In the rest of the night, Ning-Ke had been sitting between the cliffs, thinking and analyzing what the headmaster had said. He also carefully sorted out the 3 months he was imprisoned in the cliff cave and turned what he had gained in the state and will into the actual existence in his body. At dawn, Sang came back to the cliff platform. She helped him wash up, packed all the luggage and walked down the mountain along the narrow stone path. The cliffs were still beautiful, the stone path was steep, and the waterfall poured into the sea of clouds. After walking along the canyon for a few steps, he saw Chonpipi's figure. Then the senior brothers and senior sisters. The disciples of the second floor of the academy were all here to welcome youngest brother. Tang Xiaotang skipped over and untied some luggage from Sang. She glared at Ning-Ke and then took Song's little hand and walked to the front. The eldest brother looked at Ning-Ke and smiled gently, saying, "You have worked hard these days." Ning-Ke bowed to the senior brothers and senior sisters and said, "Senior brothers and senior sisters, you have worked hard?" The crowd happily surrounded him and congratulated him. The 11th brother gave him a bunch of wildflowers, but Sang was not happy. The 9th brother and the 9th brother began to play the zither and flute proudly. The 5th brother and the 8th brother found that they could not do anything. They could not drag Ning-Ke to play chess at this time, so they could only keep congratulating him like a boring cycle of 4 tribulations. The 6th brother patted his shoulder to comfort him. His hands, which were used to forging iron, almost made him spit blood. The 7th sister went forward and lovingly pinched his face, almost making him bleed. The 2nd brother stood in the distance and looked a little pale. Looking at Ning-Ke's nervous eyes, he nodded and even squeezed out a very rare smile. Today, the back of the mountain of the academy was full of laughter and laughter. In the big thatched hut with ventilation, the aroma of food filled the air. The 7th sister and Tang Xiaotang cooked a sumptuous banquet. The banquet was to welcome the youngest brother, Ning-Ke, who had successfully broken through and did not have to be imprisoned in the cliff cave to die miserably. It was also to welcome the return of the headmaster after traveling around the world. Although the welcome time was 3 months late, the most important reason was that this was Ning-Ke's apprenticeship ceremony. He would officially become the headmaster's disciple. Ning-Ke knelt in front of the headmaster's chair and kowtowed 3 times respectfully and honestly. Unfortunately, his body was too strong after cultivating the Great Spirit. The 3 kowtows caused cracks to appear on the black bricks in front of him, but his forehead still did not bleed or even bruise. There was only some dust on it. He felt very sorry that he could not take the opportunity to show his sincerity to the headmaster and flatter him. Standing up and taking a cup of warm tea from the 3rd sister, Ning-Kei walked to the headmaster and offered it with both hands. The headmaster took it and slowly took a sip. The apprenticeship ceremony was officially completed, and it seemed very simple. The 7th sister walked over with a pile of clothes and asked, "Youngest brother, choose a color." Ning-Kei was slightly startled. He looked at his senior sister's arms and found that she was holding the academy uniforms. It was spring, so it was only natural to wear spring clothes. Compared to the uniforms of the front yard, there was no obvious difference between the uniforms of the students of the 2nd floor and the academy uniforms of the front yard. The only difference was that there were more colors. He looked at the senior brothers and sisters around the thatched hut and noticed that everyone's choice seemed to be very random. The 3rd sister was still wearing the loose light blue academy uniform. The eldest brother was wearing an old coat and did not wear the academy uniform at all, and the rest of the academy uniforms were of different colors, including red and gray. The 7th sister looked at his hesitant expression and joked, "You really have to be careful. You can't change it after you choose." Ning-Kei subconsciously looked at Sang-Sang. Since they left Min Mountain and entered the city of Wei, it had always been Sang-Sang who decided what they wore. Sang-Sang nodded. Ning-Kei understood her meaning and said, "Senior sister, I want the black one." The 7th sister smiled and said, "You are the first one to choose the black one in the back of the mountain. Youngest brother really has a good taste. A man must be handsome and dressed in soaps. This is the truth, but some stupid people never understand." The 2nd brother standing behind the headmaster was inexplicably serious. The eldest brother looked at Ning-Kei, who was putting on the black academy uniform, and could not help but sigh softly. The headmaster gently stroked his beard and looked at Ning-Kei, asking, "Why did you choose the black one?" With the help of Sang-Sang, Ning-Kei buttoned the slanted cloth and answered honestly, "Black is to prevent dirt." This was the real answer. He and Sang-Sang did not think that a man must be handsome and dressed in soaps. They were more concerned about how to wash less and save water and soap. The eldest brother was stunned. The headmaster's fingers slightly froze and he smiled and shook his head. This is the 2nd chapter. Try to finish the 3rd chapter before 1 o'clock. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for it. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 398. After the banquet, 2nd brother walked to Ning-Kei and said, "The swordmaster from South Jin Kingdom is still waiting for you outside the academy. Since this matter has been settled, when will you go out?" Ning-Kei smiled and said, "Anyway, no one knows that I came out from the cliff cave. What's the hurry? Let him continue to wait. I'll rest for 2 days first." His words were a little shameless, but 2nd brother was not angry. He just looked at him and said coldly, "I have already told the instructor of the front yard that you have broken through, so don't think about delaying it. Hurry up and settle this matter. Otherwise, it will be inappropriate to let Liu Bai's brother sit at the academy's gate." Ning-Kei thought that it was not easy for him to escape from the cliff cave that was isolated from the rest of the world. He just had a meal and did not even take a bath. Now he was going to fight with someone else. How could he be a senior brother? He was furious, but he did not show any anger on his face. He looked at 2nd brother and said with grievance, "Got it. I'll go and meet that guy right now." After 2nd brother left, Chun Pippi came over and said worriedly, "What should we do? During the days when you were imprisoned in the cliff cave, that guy surnamed Liu has been waiting outside the academy. It seems that he did not wait in vain. His state seems to have improved. I don't think you can beat him." "Never mind. I'll take a rest first." Ning-Kei looked at 2nd brother's back disappearing into the forest. He looked extremely presumptuous, but his voice was very low. He said, "Now that the headmaster is back, do you think I'll be afraid of you?" Chun Pippi smiled and said, "That's right. Now that 2nd brother still wants to discipline us as strictly as before, we can complain to the headmaster. You don't know that the headmaster doesn't like to care about these trivial things. He usually keeps silent and pretends to be stupid. Then we can pretend that the headmaster has spoken to deceive eldest brother, and use eldest brother to suppress second brother. Except for your marriage, second brother has never dared to disobey eldest brother. These words were a little confusing. After a moment of silence, Ning-Kei looked at him and said with emotion, I didn't expect that your shamelessness is somewhat like mine. Chan Pippi was about to retort, but he suddenly put away the frivolous expression on his face and put his hands behind his back. He looked at Ning-Kei and said calmly, You are my younger brother. I will not argue with you. Ning-Kei was slightly surprised. When he heard the footsteps behind him and saw Tang Xiaotong's figure from the corner of his eye, he immediately understood. He looked at Chan Pippi mockingly and said, Good for you. Chan Pippi didn't dare to look him in the eye and walked towards Tang Xiaotong. Tang Xiaotong ignored him and walked directly to Ning Quebec. She said in a clear voice, Ning. As soon as the word left her mouth, the little girl thought of something and timidly shut her mouth. She looked around and realized that her teacher Yu Lian was not around. She patted her chest with lingering fear and stuck out her tongue cutely. She continued, Youngest martial uncle, I want to take Sang Sang out to play. In the early morning, a gentle spring rain fell on the back of the mountain of the academy. Tang Xiaotong was going to take Sang Sang into the mountain to pick those newborn mushrooms. Ning-Kei looked at Sang Sang and thought that the little girl had been suffering in the cliff cave with him for the past 3 months. Although she could occasionally go down the mountain for a walk, she must have had a hard time. He rubbed her head and said, Go ahead. Looking at the two girls walking up the mountain hand in hand, Chan Pippi returned to Ning-Kei's side and imagined their future life. He sighed and said, They have become good friends in advance. Shouldn't we strengthen our communication so that we won't be punished too badly after we get married? Good for you. Ning-Kei looked at him and said disdainfully, I have always been in charge of my family. When you can let Tang Xiaotong fetch water for your feet, then you are qualified to discuss these issues with me. After saying this, he turned around and walked towards the direction of Mirror Lake. Chan Pippi shouted behind him, What are you going to do? Be careful not to touch second brother. Ning-Kei was furious. He thought that Chan Pippi deliberately shouted so loudly because he wanted second brother to hear it. He turned around and shouted at Chan Pippi, who was 3 steps away, as if he was talking to a farmer on the opposite cliff. His loud voice kept echoing in the back of the mountain of the academy. I'll go to check the goods. Don't worry. I won't tell Tang Xiaotong about that. Do you hear me? Chan Pippi heard it and felt painful. He thought that second brother, third sister and even Tang Xiaotong might have heard Ning-Kei's shameless framing. He wanted to find a rabbit hole in the grass and crawl into it. It was a very ordinary-looking padao. The dark, slender blade looked like the cornices of a palace under the night sky. The lines were slightly curved and smooth, and the sharp edge glinted with a cold light. The long hilt was designed to be held with 2 hands, and a fine velvet rope was tied around it. From its appearance it looked like any one of the 3 padaos. But when Ning-Kei held the padao, he knew that it was a brand new blade. This was because a completely different feeling came from his palm. This slender and long padao was unimaginably heavy, completely inconsistent with the size and length of the padao in his eyes. For such a thin and long blade to have such weight, one could imagine how dense it was. Naturally, one could also guess how tough it was. You said to combine the 3 padaos into one, so I refined all 3 padaos into this one. Sixth brother looked at the padao in Ning-Kei's hands like looking at a child and said honestly, I thought it would be easy, but I didn't expect it to be so difficult. The melting of ink was smooth, but the tempering part was troublesome. To combine the 3 padaos into one meant that 3 times the amount of metal had to be melted into the same volume. Ning-Kei thought that if it was not tempered, how could it be done? He couldn't help but feel grateful to sixth brother. Sixth brother handed over a scabbard made of unknown leather and said, The talisman lines on the padao are the ones you designed. But fourth brother said that it's better for you to carve them yourself. Ning-Kei sincerely thanked sixth brother, and was ready to carve the talisman. With the experience of making primordial 13 arrows, this was not too difficult for him. However, he seemed to think of something. After a moment of silence, he put the heavy padao back into the scabbard and looked at the puzzled sixth brother. He said, let's talk about it later. Of course you should decide your own weapon. Sixth brother said, youngest brother, I just want to ask you one thing. I'm really satisfied with this padao. If you want to give it a name, you must think of a good one. Ninkei's body was slightly stiff. He thought of the experience when they developed talisman arrows together last time. He thought of the extremely unreliable names such as Silver Arrow, Cloud-Piercing Arrow and Primordial 13 Arrows. He immediately understood sixth brother's worries and said firmly, Senior brother, rest assured. I will ask the teacher to give it a name. Sixth brother hesitated for a moment and said, youngest brother, actually, the teacher's name is not very reliable. The two of them stared at each other and finally decided to temporarily put aside the matter of naming the new padao. Opening the box, Ninkei looked at another thing that he had asked sixth brother to make and said happily, I didn't expect it to be so smooth. Senior brother, what material did you use? The craftsmanship of this gadget is not difficult. Sixth brother said, I asked the Ministry of Works to find some black crystals and then made some frames. I also made an extra one. There are 3 sets here. Ninkei thought that the more the better. Suddenly, he thought of another thing and looked around to make sure that Sangsang was not nearby. He came to sixth brother and whispered for a long time. Sixth brother frowned slightly and asked confusedly, it's easy to find transparent crystals. It's not difficult even if it has no impurities. If it is to prevent dust, why must it have such a small arc? The requirements for grinding and carving are too high. Even if we use water to grind it, it can't be guaranteed. Ninkei hesitated for a moment and said, I have a friend who has poor eyesight and always sees things a little blurry. If she wears this thing, it can improve her eyesight. Sixth brother was slightly surprised and thought that youngest brother was really talented and had so many wonderful ideas and wisdom in his mind. He could even cure eyesight? Just when he was about to get to the bottom of it and figure out why the curved transparent crystal could help people with impaired vision, the heavy leather curtain was lifted and the fourth brother walked in. Looking at the knife on Ninkei's back, fourth brother asked, have you finished carving the talisman? Sixth brother shook his head. Ninkei explained, I have something to do later. I will carve it later. Fourth brother slightly frowned and said, so you know you have something to do? Second brother asked you to solve the problem quickly. Why are you still here? Although those onlookers can't enter the back mountain, I feel uncomfortable when I think of the crowd outside the academy's gate. Ninkei thought faintly. Just because he felt uncomfortable, he wanted to drive his youngest brother out of the academy to fight. As his senior brothers, they naturally thought that the young powerhouse from the South Jin Kingdom was just an insignificant piece of trash. But that person was the younger brother of the Sage of Sword, Liu Bai. Your youngest brother might not be able to defeat him. He looked at fourth brother who was walking towards the sand table and tentatively asked, Senior brother, where is second brother? Fourth brother impatiently waved his hand and signaled him to hurry to the academy's side gate to finish the matter. He said, second brother went fishing with the headmaster at the West Pond. Fishing at the West Pond, not only could he enjoy the scenery and the fun of fishing, but he could also accompany the headmaster and flatter him. It was really a happy thing. But he had to go to the academy's side gate to fight and struggle like a fish on a hook? The more Ninkei thought about it, the more he felt it was unfair. He did not want to leave the back mountain at all. However, he was worried that if he stayed in the back mountain, he would be seen by second brother. That was more dangerous than fighting with the Sage of Swords' younger brother. Suddenly, he realized that the most dangerous place was also the safest place. So he followed the sound of the waterfall and quietly walked to the courtyard of second brother. He climbed the low courtyard wall with both hands and looked into the courtyard. After confirming that the scary big white goose was not there, he immediately felt relieved. Ninkei casually pushed the door open and walked in. He looked at the young and cute little boy in the room and said proudly, I want to take a bath and sleep. Do you have hot water? The little boy opened his eyes wide and looked at him innocently. Everyone in the academy knew that a young powerhouse from the South Jin Kingdom had challenged Ninkei to a duel. And that person had been sitting on the futon outside the academy's side gate and waiting for Ninkei for 3 months. In those 3 months, the powerhouse from the South Jin Kingdom had been exposed to the wind and the sun, drenched in rain and covered in dust. His life could be said to be difficult, even more so than Ning-Ke, who was in seclusion in the cliff cave. Ning-Ke knew the current situation, but he did not immediately accept the challenge after coming out of seclusion. Instead, he had the leisure to take a bath and sleep. This is the third chapter. Try to finish the fourth chapter before 3 o'clock. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 399. Looking at the unreasonable Ning-Ke, who was about to take a bath and sleep, the little boy was stunned. After a long while, he came to his senses and asked in a trembling voice, "Young master, what are you going to do?" Ning-Ke smiled and said, "I'm going to eat you alive. Hurry up and pour me a bowl of soy sauce and some horseradish." The little boy was shocked and embarrassed. He said shyly, "Young master, I'm not tasty. Young master often says that I don't like to wash my feet and I smell." Ning-Ke was startled and laughed. He said, Okay, I'll wash myself and eat myself." The little boy was really a well-behaved child. He didn't know how to refuse Ning-Ke's ridiculous request and went to the kitchen to boil a big pot of hot water. In the steam, Ning-Ke lay in the big wooden tub contentedly and looked at the little boy who was busy looking for a towel. He asked, "Speaking of which, I still don't know your name." The little boy put the towel in the hole of the tub and answered softly, "I'm Su Jialuan." "That's a good name, but it sounds too elegant. I have to change it." Ning-Ke waved his hand and said, "Your voice is always so soft. I'll call you Matzi from now on. It sounds cute." The little boy smiled and went to get another tub of hot water. Then he said seriously, "Little Wenzi is a good name. But the name Su Jialuan was given by young master. Should I go and ask him now?" Ning-Ke was shocked and his head sank into the water. He almost choked and said, "Don't tell him. You know your young master's temper." After taking a bath, Ning-Ke really had a good sleep in second brother's courtyard. When he woke up, the sun had already passed the middle of the sky and was slowly moving to the west, shining on the courtyard. After changing into a brand new black academy uniform, Ning-Ke asked the little boy to help him comb his hair. He looked at himself in the bronze mirror and was very satisfied. He thought that anyone could comb his hair better than Sang-Sang. After thanking the little boy, Ning-Ke left the small courtyard. Although he really did not want to fight with Sword Saint Lu Bai's younger brother, he knew that Lu Bai would wait outside the academy for 3 months and would definitely not leave midway. He could not hide in the academy for the rest of his life. Eventually he would have to fight with Lu Bai. It was better to fight sooner rather than later. Because he had been in seclusion in the cliff cave for 3 months, he could smell the spring breeze and see the wildflowers when he broke out of the cave. At this moment, both his physical and mental state were at their most perfect state. It was even vaguely similar to the feeling he had after breaking the realm by the Daming Lake in the wilderness. The duel between the brother of Lu Bai, the Sage of Sword of South Jin Kingdom, and Ning-Ke, Mr. 13 of the Academy, was much more sensational than the duel between Ning-Ke and Monk Guanhai. It attracted the attention of all the cultivators in the world, and even many common people. Although the senior brothers at the back of the mountain of the Academy were anxious for Ning-Ke to settle this matter, they had no interest in the matter itself. They were all obsessed and had long surpassed the obsession of winning or losing. They did not care at all whether Ning-Ke could defeat that young powerhouse. As for the possibility that Ning-Ke might be injured or even killed in this world, there was no one who dared to kill the core disciple of the headmaster of the academy at the gate of the academy. Not to mention that the young powerhouse from South Jin Kingdom was the brother of Lu Bai, the Sage of Sword, even the most powerful Sage of Sword. Lu Bai himself would not dare to do such a thing, because the headmaster of the academy was there. Therefore, when Ning-Ke finished his bath and meditation, put on his black academy uniform and floated to the front yard in the spring breeze, no one came to see him off. Of course Sang-Sang would follow him. Tang Xiaotang followed Sang-Sang. Chun Pippi followed Tang Xiaotang. When they walked to the meadow at the edge of the cliff platform at the back of the mountain, Ning-Ke suddenly stopped and looked at the stream below the meadow. Second brother's big white goose was by the stream at this time. Today it did not feed the fish. Instead, it held its head high and walked proudly in the meadow. The big black horse followed behind the big white goose dejectedly. not daring to fall behind or take a step forward. The little snow wolf cowered behind the big black horse, carefully keeping pace with the two fellows in front. The big white goose walked very seriously. When it reached the end of the meadow, it turned back again. It walked in a straight line without any deviation. When it turned back, it saw the big black horse dejectedly and angrily bark twice, its voice very strict. The big black horse suddenly seemed to see Ning Quebec. It hurriedly raised its head in fear, and pretended to be arrogant and elegant. It also wanted to please the big white goose, so it grinned and looked very funny. The four people standing on the meadow stared at this scene in a daze. Tang Xiaotang glanced at Ning Ke and said mockingly, "Youngest uncle's horse is really similar to your temperament. It is as timid as a mouse and flatters others." Ning Ke looked at the black horse's appearance and felt extremely embarrassed. Now that Tang Xiaotang said it, he became even more embarrassed and said, "The little snow wolf raised by youngest nephew is quite spirited, but why is its tail always drooping?" Tang Xiaotang sneered and said, "It's better than someone who let his opponent wait in the sun outside the academy, while he secretly bathed and slept. Youngest uncle is really insidious." Ning Ke said, "You flatter me." Chun Pippi wanted to explain for Ning Ke, but when he looked at Tang Xiaotang's clear eyes, he somehow felt guilty and said, "Yes, younger brother's action is a little too insidious." Sang Sang looked at the meadow and said, "That big white goose is really arrogant. It looks like it is training the army. In that case, isn't it the general in the back of the mountain? It's useless no matter how proud the general is, because he has to train the army for His Majesty to see." Ning Ke looked at the old yellow cow who was resting in the grass by the stream with its eyes closed and its front knees bent. As expected, the big white goose led the big black horse and the little snow wolf forward 4 times and came to a place not far from the old yellow cow. It respectfully lowered its proud head. The old yellow cow slowly opened its eyes and looked at it. It gently shook its head up and down and then seemed to feel that this matter was too boring. It turned around and chewed on some grass before continuing to rest. Ning Ke looked at the old yellow cow that chewed the grass into foam but did not swallow it. Instead, it spat it out in disgust. He looked at the 3 fellows standing behind it and pondered. This was the magical back of the mountain of the academy. If the beasts in the back of the mountain were so arrogant, then as a person from the back of the mountain, he should be even more arrogant. Then he would go and prove his arrogance. The side door of the academy was very remote and usually quiet. Other than the people from the back of the mountain who would occasionally come and go from here, few people would come here. However, after the powerhouse from the South Jin Kingdom, Lu Yiqing, submitted a letter of challenge to the academy and sat down on the futon outside the side door, the area around the side door suddenly became lively. The students from the front yard of the academy and the citizens of Chang and came to watch the show, as if they wanted to turn this place into a scenic spot. Especially today, there were more than 1,000 people gathered outside the side door. If not for the imperial court's quick response and the Yulin royal guards to maintain order, the quiet grass would have been trampled by the excited crowd. It was rare for ordinary people to see cultivators, let alone cultivators fighting. Chang'an was full of powerhouses, so the people in the city were more knowledgeable in this aspect. However, it was still extremely rare for them to have a chance to see it up close. The news of someone challenging the academy had been spread for 3 months. Everyone knew the location of the duel. Even many citizens of Chang and had come to see the person from the South Jin Kingdom sitting at the door of the academy. Today, when the news of Mr. 13 of the academy breaking out of the cave spread to Chang, and countless people came to watch the show, there was no doubt that it was a big show. There was a bluestone road on a hill not far away. Dozens of horse carriages were parked on the side of the road. It seemed that some young ladies from mansions in Chang and could not resist the temptation of the liveliness and came here. Among the dozens of carriages, most of them were naturally the nobles. They couldn't push forward with all their might like the common people, and they couldn't disregard their status and take the risk to climb the poplar tree. Moreover, they climbed higher and higher just to find the best vantage point. These nobles included the relevant officials of the Tang Empire and a few generals from the military. Naturally, there were also cultivators from various sects who came after hearing the news. The envoy from the South Jin Kingdom and a few disciples from the Sword Garret stood silently beside their horse carriages. The officials from the imperial center administration of the Tang Empire smiled and stood not far from them. He Mingqi, the Taoist from the South Gate Temple of Haotian, held the yellow oiled paper umbrella under his armpit and stood quietly beside a horse carriage. The horse carriage was black and embroidered with complicated golden patterns. It looked majestic and beautiful, but there was no one around the horse carriage on such a crowded road. That was the respect that everyone showed to the horse carriage. The horse carriage belonged to the West Hill Divine Palace's diplomatic corps. The great divine priest of revelation was not in the carriage. The duel between a student from the second floor of the academy and Liu Bai's brother was far from enough for this bigwig to deign to appear. In the carriage sat a man with a snow-white beard and a very young appearance. He was Chang Lishue, the priest of the Revelation Department of the West Hill Divine Palace. Chang Lishue's position in the Divine Hall was even higher than that of Prince Long Qing. He could sit side by side with the Tao addict Yi Hongyu before she went to the wilderness. He was also an important bigwig. Chang Lishue gently lifted the curtains and looked at He Mingqi, who was standing quietly by the window. After a slight hesitation, he smiled and said, "Senior brother He, why don't you come up and sit?" He Mingqi smiled and said, "I'm used to standing." After a moment of silence, Chang Lishue looked at the side door of the academy at the bottom of the hill. He looked at Liu Bai, who was sitting on the futon. He found that under the gaze of countless people and surrounded by countless discussions, this young powerhouse from the South Jin Kingdom still maintained a clear mind. It had been half a day since the news that Ningke had broken out of seclusion and was going to attend the duel had spread. The person who should have appeared long ago had not yet appeared. The surrounding people of Chang and city were already bored to death, and some had even left. However, Liu Bai's face did not show any signs of anxiety. His posture and even his clothes did not change, which was very frightening. Chang Lishue looked at him and was slightly moved. He suddenly asked, "Senior brother He, do you think Ningke will come out?" He Mingqi smiled and said, "Ningke is the most unlike the headmaster's disciple, so I can't say for sure." Chang Lishue thought of their encounter in the Palace of the Wilderness and could not help but laugh. He said, "He is indeed a very interesting person, but I think he will arrive soon." Not that he was about to arrive, but that he had already arrived. The side door of the academy was slowly pushed open from the inside. A black figure appeared in front of everyone. Everyone cheered. This is the 4th chapter. I will try to finish the 5th chapter before 4:30. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 400. Ningke's well-tailored black academy uniform swayed gently in the warm spring breeze. His black hair was tightly tied up and then tied into a very simple and capable bun. His cheeks were slightly thinner and he looked more handsome than before. This was the image that Ningke had when he appeared in front of everyone, looking particularly refreshed. There were many students from the front yard of the academy watching the battle. Chu Yuxian and the others were quite familiar with Ningke, so they couldn't help cheering loudly when they saw Ningquebec infected by the atmosphere of the academy students. The crowd became more excited, and some even started whistling. Zhong Dajuan stood in the crowd and looked at the young man in black on the stone steps in the distance. He thought of the scenes when he first entered the academy 2 years ago. A trace of hatred and jealousy flashed in his eyes, and then all those emotions turned into frustration and loneliness. Now he and Ningke were in 2 different worlds. Even though he was a disciple of the Yongguan family, he could no longer catch Ningke's clothes, let alone take revenge on him. Cheers and applause were carried by the spring breeze to the dozens of carriages on the side of the official road on the hillside. The young ladies of Chang'an who were yearning for love eagerly opened the curtains, their faces full of hope and worship. Many people, including Chang Lishue, the priest of the Revelation Department of the Divine Hall, became solemn. In order to watch the battle, all the major cultivation sects in the world came, except for the sadhus of the White Tower Temple of the Yueluan Kingdom, because they had all been driven out of the country by a decree of the Tang Emperor. These people from the cultivation sects were very interested in Liu Yiqing, who was originally unknown but suddenly gained a great reputation. They wanted to know how powerful the younger brother of the Sage of Sword Liu Bai was. But what they really wanted to see was Ningke's performance in the battle. The academy was the only unknown place that was connected to the human world, and it could compete with the divine halls of West Hill. In the minds of those who vaguely knew about the other unknown places, the real top power of the academy was even more terrible than that of the divine halls of West Hill. But the question was, how powerful were the people on the second floor of the academy? Everyone knew that the headmaster of the academy was very powerful, but they didn't know how powerful he was. Only a few people had met Mr. First or Mr. Second of the academy, and they all sighed with emotion afterward, but never revealed any details. For decades, the people of the academy had not shown their brilliance to the world. The reason was that no one from the academy entered the human world after Mr. Ku, until Ningke appeared. After Mr. Ku disappeared from the world, the West Hill Divine Palace forbade anyone from mentioning his name and deeds. However, the strongest man in the world had left too many scars and shocking memories. Therefore, all the cultivation sects in the world wanted to confirm Ningke's power and state of mind. The battle between Ningke and monk Guanhai of the Lang Temple took place in the Taoist Hall of the Southern Gate Temple. People only knew that it was a time of great brightness, but they did not know the details inside. The battle between Ningke and the Yueluan Kingdom Stone had shocked all the cultivation sections. That was because he had defeated a high monk from the Buddhism sect from the unknown place in a battle of psyche. The Buddhism sect's Vedanta ascetic spirit was the strongest in the cultivation world, no matter if it was the Zen psyche or the will. At the end of the battle on Morning Street, Ningke had directly chopped off Dao Shi's head. This fact shocked the various cultivation sects and gave rise to some very bad associations. Kill the Buddha and kill the gods? Mr. Ku seemed to have killed his way through and made a name for himself in the academy. Until today, no one dared to disrespect the academy. Even though the legend said that this powerful man had been killed by God, even the West Hill Divine Palace did not dare to openly criticize him. Everyone left their sects and came to the academy. They wanted to use this rare opportunity to personally confirm the true power of the second floor of the academy. In order to prevent another Mr. Ku from appearing in the human world, they wanted to see the academy fail. The title of the weakest world wayfarer in the history of the academy had spread from the mouth of the Tao addict of the West Hill Divine Palace to the entire cultivation world. Even though Ningke had won 2 consecutive battles after entering the human world, and even though he had once defeated Prince Longqing, everyone still firmly believed that there was something wrong with these victories. Previously, when they saw Lu Yiqing sitting quietly on the futon, as if he was separated from the world, they were all in awe. They all thought that he was indeed the brother of the Sage of Sword, Liu Bai, who had been immersed in the upper see-through state for so many years at such a young age. He even had signs of breaking through the realm. It would be a piece of cake for him to defeat Ningke in such a state. However, now that they saw Ningke standing on the stone steps and felt his casual aura, they could not help but feel that they had underestimated his strength when they thought of the rumor that he had entered the cave to meditate in seclusion. Chang Lishua gently stroked his silver-white hair and quietly looked at the side door of the academy at the foot of the hill. He suddenly asked Senior Brother He, "Who do you think will win?" He Mingqi smiled and said, "Of course it's Ning Quebec." Chang Lishua asked strangely, "Why are you so sure?" He Mingqi said, "Because he is a student of the headmaster of the academy." Chang Lishua suddenly understood and felt that his previous judgment was a little funny. He said, "That's true." Ningke stood on the stone steps and looked at the excited classmates in the front yard. He smiled and waved at them. Then he looked at the man sitting on the futon by the side door. The man was very young. He sat on the futon like an old tree with thousands of feet of roots. He gave people a feeling that no matter how strong the mountain wind was, it could not move him at all. Ningke knew that this man was Lu Yiqing from the South Jin Kingdom. He had meditated outside the academy for 3 months in order to challenge him. He also knew that this man was the brother of the Sage of Sword, Liu Bai. The Yulin royal guards pulled a few extremely long ropes and blocked the crowd outside the ropes. They opened up a large open space in front of the side door of the academy. That open space was under the stone steps. The open space was very big, but Ningke and Lu Yiqing were very close to each other. Lu Yiqing stood up and looked at him quietly. After a moment, the futon that had accompanied him for 3 months under his feet broke into pieces. He had sat outside the academy for 3 whole months without the shelter of the cliff cave. He was weathered by the wind, rain, and sun. His hair was tangled and his clothes were full of dust. The nails on his hands that were exposed outside his sleeves were full of black mud stains. They did not look like hands that were used to hold a sword at all. Compared to Ning Ke, who had just showered and changed into a new set of clothes, Lu Yiqing looked more like a beggar. However, the expression on his face was very calm, as if there was not a speck of dust on his clothes. They were even cleaner than Ning Ke's black uniform. Lu Yiqing looked at Ning Ke with extremely bright eyes. He was indeed very tired and haggard. But his sword had been washed in the cold wind and rain outside the side door of the academy for 3 whole months, and it was extremely bright. He had waited for Ning Ke for 3 whole months. Today he finally appeared. This sword that was as bright as spring water happened to have the most majestic sword style. Ning Ke? Lu Yiqing asked. Ning Ke nodded. Lu Yiqing suddenly laughed. As he smiled, the pieces of the futon under his feet floated off the ground. The dust on the ground moved even though there was no wind. It seemed to be rolling in all directions, forming a very strange scene. When the dust rolled further and further away like a snake, gradually leaving the open space, the people watching the battle behind the ropes looked at the dust rushing toward them and subconsciously wanted to step back, but they could not squeeze out. Just when they secretly thought that it was bad, the dust suddenly stopped in front of the ropes. It formed a shallow ridge of soil. Inside and outside the ridge were 2 different worlds. Inside the ridge was the world of battle, and it was not to be disturbed. Suppressed exclamations sounded around the side door of the academy, and then it fell into a dead silence. The dozens of horse carriages on the side of the state highway were also shrouded in a dead atmosphere. The noble ladies in the horse carriages were shocked and tightly covered their mouths. The cultivators in the horse carriages looked at Lu Yiqing in silence, not knowing how to react. They thought about how Lu Bai, the Sage of Sword, had dared to send his own brother to challenge the academy. This meant that this person's state must be very high and he must be very powerful. Moreover, they had already confirmed that Lu Yiqing was indeed powerful enough. However, they did not expect him to be so powerful. His psyche power moved with his smile, and he could disperse all the dust in the field, and he did it so perfectly. This seemingly strange scene required extremely delicate control of the qi of heaven and earth. The officials of the Imperial Center Administration of the Tang Empire looked at the side door of the academy in silence, their faces full of worry. After Lu Yiqing revealed his state, no one was optimistic about Ning Quebeccheng Lishua looked there and also fell into silence. Unlike other cultivation sects, the West Hill Divine Palace, which led the world, had information about Lu Yiqing many years ago, because he was the brother of the Sage of Sword Lu Bai. Before Lu Yiqing became famous, the West Hill Divine Palace already knew that he was an extremely rare genius in sword Taoism, and put him on the list of key observation. Looking at Lu Yiqing's state, Chang Lishue realized that this person was even more powerful than what the Divine Hall had imagined. A trace of worry gradually appeared between his brows. Of course, the West Hill Divine Palace did not want another person like Mr. Ku to appear in the academy, but at the same time, they did not want the Sword Garret of South Jin Kingdom to produce another powerful person, the Sage of Sword Lu Bai. Lu Bai was the chief visiting professor of the Divine Hall, and the South Jin Kingdom was also the Divine Hall's greatest power in the secular world. But if the Sword Garret of South Jin Kingdom grew stronger with Lu Yiqing's growth, then the Divine Hall's influence on the Sword Garret would be relatively weaker. What if the Sword Garret of South Jin Kingdom switched positions in the future? So you are a treasure sword that the Sage of Sword has hidden for many years. Chang Lishua looked at Lu Yiqing in the distance and said bitterly, "It seems that even if Ning Ke is the core disciple of the headmaster of academy, he will not be your match today." At the side door of the academy, Lu Yiqing looked at Ning Ke and said, "You're finally here." His tone was very calm, but the deepest part of his voice revealed undisguised pride and confidence. This was because he was going to defeat the core disciple of the headmaster of academy today. Then, even in front of the academy, he should finally have his own pride and confidence. According to the usual story, after Lu Yiqing said that he was finally here, Ning Ke should be silent for a moment before replying, "What will come," and then he would heroically lose this battle. But Ning Ke had never been a person who played his cards according to common sense. In order to win the battle, he would do anything. Even if he did not take the risk of changing cards, he could choose not to look at his opponent's cards. Ning Ke did not look at Lu Yiqing's sharp eyes. He looked at the untainted blue brick floor, which was so clean that it could reflect one's reflection, and sincerely praised, "I'm afraid your sweeping skills are the same as your brother's, the best in the world. This is the 5th chapter. My eyes are blurry and I am very hungry. I am going to rest for a while and eat something before writing. I will try to finish the 6th chapter before 7:30. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation." Chapter 401. Lu Yiqing was startled, but he did not fly into a rage because of Ning Ke's words. Instead, his eyes showed that he had expected it. He calmly explained, "I have been sitting on the futon these days. Although I didn't mean to, it always affected the cleaning of the academy, so I tried to do it myself. But I am familiar with it, so I don't admire it." Ning Ke did not expect that the other party would not be angry. He was surprised and naturally became vigilant, but he did not show it in his expression or words. He smiled and said, "I'm more used to using a broom." Lu Yiqing smiled mockingly, thinking that they were going to start bickering again. It seemed that Ning Ke was indeed as rumored. He would never miss any opportunity to disturb his opponent's mood. However, just as he was about to reply, Ning Ke suddenly stopped smiling. He brushed the front of his academy uniform with his left hand, and put his right hand in the air in front of him. He said calmly and attentively, "Please." His posture was very imposing, and the calm and focused expression on his face, coupled with the extremely concise word "please," immediately attracted a round of cheers from the crowd. The sudden change in the atmosphere made Lu Yiqing squint his eyes. According to the Cultivation World's description of Mr. 13 of the Academy, Ning Ke, he was a ruthless and decisive person, but he was used to talking nonsense and bickering like a child. The Judicial Department of the West Hill Divine Palace had once commented that all the nonsense, bickering, and childish impulsiveness were just Ning Ke's tricks to disturb his opponent's state of mind. Lu Yiqing thought that he had a deep understanding of Ning Ke's temperament. That was why when Ning Ke said those mocking words that were enough to make many people lose their minds and even vomit blood, he could stay calm. He was even prepared to talk to this person for a long time under the watchful eyes of the crowd. However, he did not expect that the other party would be so direct and simple today. Could it be that he really had some kind of fortuitous encounter after cultivating in seclusion in the cave for 3 months? Lu Yiqing glanced at Ning Ke warily and turned to walk to the center of the clean and dustless ground. As he stepped forward, his emotions gradually returned to the initial absolute calmness. Ning Ke also walked to the field and waited quietly. Everyone's gaze shifted from the academy's side door to the green brick floor as the two walked. When no one noticed her, Sang Sang walked out from the side door. Perhaps because of Tang Xiaotong's identity as a member of the Devil's Doctrine, Chun Pippi and her did not appear. Lu Yiqing raised his left hand. His slender muddy palm held an ordinary-looking cyan steel sword. He raised his sword and looked at Ning Ke, saying emotionlessly, "I know your most powerful weapon is the arrow. I will still use the sword." Sang Sang stood under the green tree at the edge of the field and listened to his words. She untied the heavy luggage on her back and put the big black umbrella aside. She found the dark iron arrow box and was ready to give it to Ning Ke as soon as he spoke. Ning Ke did not speak. He looked at the ordinary cyan steel sword in Lu Yiqing's left hand and slowly raised his eyebrows, because he recognized this sword. 2 years ago, when he came to Chang'an from the city of Wei, he and Sang Sang rented a shop on Lin 47th Street and opened the Old Brush Pen Shop. At that time, the business of the Old Brush Pen Shop was not good, so he clearly remembered who the first customer of the Old Brush Pen Shop was. It was raining in Chang'an that day. Under the eaves outside the Old Brush Pen Shop, a middle-aged man was sheltering from the rain. The man was dressed in a green robe, and his eyes were handsome and free. His smile could brighten up the gloomy rain. The middle-aged man was the owner of the shop and habitually wore a sword on his waist. The reason why Ninkei could clearly remember the middle-aged man was not only because he was the first customer of the old brush pen shop. On another rainy day, the middle-aged man came to the old brush pen shop with an oil paper umbrella. At that time, Ninkei squatted on the ground and ate noodles. The middle-aged man squatted beside him and said a few words to him. "I'm going to kill. I need someone by my side." Because of these 2 words, the 500 taels of silver note and darkie's entrustment, Ninkei followed the middle-aged man into the rainy night and into the shabby Spring Breeze Pavilion street that had not been renovated. Then they began to kill side by side until everyone was killed. They walked back to the old brush pen shop and ate a bowl of noodles with fried eggs. The middle-aged man had a very arrogant surname and a very gentle name. His surname was Chao, which was the Chao of the Tang dynasty. His name was Chao Shaoshu. Ninkei and Chao Shaoshu did not meet many times. But he remembered Chao Shaoshu and would never forget him for the rest of his life. He also recognized the seemingly ordinary cyan steel sword that Chao Shaoshu carried. But that sword was held in the hands of Lu Yiqing, a powerhouse from the South Jin Kingdom. This was not the Spring Breeze Pavilion. Ninkei looked at the sword and said after a moment of silence, "I won't use arrows today. I'll use a knife." For some unknown reason, he did not ask Lu Yiqing about the origin of the sword. Also for some unknown reason, Lu Yiqing took the initiative to mention the sword. "You recognize this sword?" Ninkei nodded and said, "This is the sword of old Chao of the Spring Breeze Pavilion." Lu Yiqing looked at him and said calmly, "Don't you want to know why this sword is in my hands?" Ninkei thought for a moment and said honestly, "Yes." Lu Yiqing seemed to be satisfied with his answer and said, "Old Chao of the Spring Breeze Pavilion. What an interesting name. On that rainy spring night 2 years ago, I think the Spring Breeze Pavilion smelled like blood. You may have forgotten that you had killed a sword master from the South Jin Kingdom." Ninkei silently recalled the scene on that rainy night. Even though Chao Shaoshu and he had killed too many people that night, it was not easy to forget that powerful sword master from the South Jin Kingdom. He murmured, "So that person was a disciple of the sword Garrett of the South Jin Kingdom." Lu Yiqing said expressionlessly, "He was the core disciple of my eldest brother, but he died tragically under the joint attack of the 2 of you. There has to be an explanation for this. Chao Shaoshu was defeated by me, so his sword is now in my hands. But you are still missing, so I waited for you at the gate of the academy for 3 months." Ninkei's eyebrows had been slightly raised ever since he saw the sword. Even when he was answering honestly, his eyebrows did not fall. However, when he heard Lu Yiqing say that Chao Shaoshu had been defeated by him, his eyebrows suddenly fell down. His expression was extremely calm, even a little chilly. Lu Yiqing said, "Do you want to know where Chao Shaoshu is now?" Ninkei's tone was still very honest. "Yes." Lu Yiqing looked at him and said coldly, "Then show me your true strength and fight with me. Regardless of the outcome of this battle, I will tell you what you want to know." Ninkei suddenly laughed. After thinking for a moment, he turned around and walked towards Sang Sang, who was under the green tree by the side of the field. Lu Yiqing thought that he was going to retrieve the rumored terrifying iron bow and smiled proudly. Ninkei walked to Sang Sang but did not move. He was not here to retrieve the primordial 13 arrows, but to retrieve something else that sixth brother had just prepared for him. Because at that moment, he was ready to kill this South Jin Kingdom swordsman called Lu Yiqing. But when he walked to Sang Sang, he suddenly changed his mind. Because sometimes being alive was more painful than being dead. So he walked past Sang Sang and returned to the field. Lu Yiqing looked at him, who was empty-handed, and frowned slightly. He said, "I want to see your true state." "I said that I will not use arrows today. I will only use knives." Ninkei stretched out his right hand and looked at him calmly. "Because you are not worthy." Lu Yiqing still did not get angry. He asked indifferently, "Then who is worthy?" "My iron bow has shot Prince Longqing and the Tao addict. You are not as good as these 2, so you are not worthy." After saying this, Ninkei took a deep breath and tightened his grip. His right hand grasped the hilt of the knife behind him that was pointing diagonally at the sky. He slowly pulled out the black and long padao. His movement was very normal and casual, but it was firm and did not allow anyone to interrupt him. Just like that rainy night 2 years ago, when a middle-aged man in a green robe killed his enemy in front of him with his sword. He was defenseless in close combat and did not hesitate to give his life to Ning Quebec. Lu Yiqing clearly sensed the change in Ning Kei's aura, but his emotions did not change. His dirty and dusty clothes fluttered in the spring breeze. He was like a bright sword that had been washed by the spring water. His most respected brother had once told him that no matter what kind of enemy he faced, and no matter how the enemy changed, all he needed to do was to pull out the sword and stab into the enemy's body. So Lu Yiqing calmly pulled out the cyan steel sword from the sheath and stabbed straight at Ning Kei's body. It was straight like a stick, like a willow that was frozen in time and no longer swaying. There was no sword style, and no flying sword whistled through the air. This was the simplest sword, but it was the most powerful sword. The sword garret of South Jin Kingdom was different from other sword sects in the world. They did not cultivate the art of swordsmanship. The disciples of the sword garret would never use their psyche power to control the chi of heaven and earth, and then use it to control their natal swords. The disciples of the sword garret only trusted the hand that held the sword. Their most powerful swordsmanship was the sword in their hands. With the sword in their hands, they did not need to use the chi of heaven and earth to control it. They could directly gather the chi around the sword. This was the swordsmanship of the world's most powerful sage of sword, Liu Bai. With the sword in his hands, it was like a river. Invincible in front of him was invincible in 10,000 miles. The loneliness of the past years in the private school of his hometown, the cold looks he received after coming to the sword garret, the thoughts he gained after sitting in front of the academy for 3 months, the scornful looks of the Tangs, the angry but silent discussions, and the pride in the depths of his heart, all melted into this one sword. It was such a simple strike, but Lu Yiqing had poured all of his cultivation into it. The air in front of the blade suddenly collapsed and retreated in all directions, creating an absolute vacuum. The few green leaves that danced in the air could not even land on the clean green brick ground before they turned into powder. The chi of heaven and earth outside the side door of the academy shook violently and gathered into the sword in his hands. Then it seeped out from the blade, forming a wind and thunder that whistled. In an instant, Lu Yiqing had crossed the distance between the two of them. The tip of the sword carried the wind and thunder and directly hit Ning Kei's face. This is the 6th chapter. I'm crazy. Then there's still the 7th chapter. I'll sleep after I finish it. I really don't know when I'll update. I'll try to finish it before 8:30. I have to continue writing after I wake up. Wipe my sweat. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 402. The wind and thunder at the tip of Lu Yiqing's sword shocked all the onlookers. People's exclamations were still brewing in their throats, and there was dead silence. How could such a simple sword contain such a powerful force? Including the cultivators among the onlookers at the side door of the academy today, only Chang Lishue, the priest of the Revelation Department of the West Hill Divine Palace, could really understand this simple sword. He was the only one who had already noticed the horror of Lu Yiqing's sword when he just stabbed. He held the window with his right hand and remained silent. This simple sword was actually not simple. It had the fullest and even the most perfect willpower, with 100 days of waiting and forbearance, and finally had Liu Bai's sword style. Because it was simple, it was powerful. Everything in the world was like this, including Haotian's divine light. Chang Lishue held the window with one hand and felt the sharp sword style from the side door of the academy. He thought that if he was facing this simple sword, he would definitely not be able to take it. He could only retreat to a place where there was no place to retreat, and use the desperate situation to squeeze out the possibility of the impossible. Even if Prince Longqing was still alive, facing such a simple and powerful sword style, facing the wind and thunder at the tip of the sword, he could only choose to temporarily avoid it and risk being injured to find the last chance of survival and killing. If it was the Tao addict in front of Lu Yiqing's sword, could she block it? Chang Lishue thought of the news from West Hill and silently added in his heart. Of course it was the Tao addict before she went to the wilderness. Then he denied his own thoughts in his heart. If it was the Tao addict before she went to the wilderness, she would definitely not block this simple sword, but would attack with a straight face. Before she was stabbed to death, the person holding the sword would die first. So she would not die. She could deal with Lu Yiqing's sword. The wind and thunder came, and there was a hidden sword style in it. Facing such a dangerous situation and such a powerful sword, Ning Ke chose to close his eyes. There was only one explanation for closing his eyes at such a moment. That was, he wanted to commit suicide. Ning Ke did not want to commit suicide, so he slashed forward while closing his eyes. He knew that with his current cultivation state, he would definitely not be able to take on this sword. So he did not even think of taking it, nor did he try to attack like Yi Hongyu. Instead, he attacked back. The way he swung his blade was very simple. It was even simpler and more primitive than Lu Yiqing's sword thrust. This was because the saber itself was simpler and more primitive than the sword. Swords were deliberately forged by humans to be used as weapons of salute or slaughter. The sword could stab people, but it couldn't stab anything else. The saber was a stone saber that humans picked up from the heavens and the earth. It was first used for hunting. A saber could be used to chop people, but it could also be used to chop many things such as firewood. Ning Ke felt the heavy weight from the hilt and the subtle reverberation of the blade cutting through the air. A sense of firmness and reliability that he had not felt for a long time returned to his body. He had not chopped firewood for a long time, and he missed it very much. Today he was chopping wood again. Although his eyes were closed, his movements were still as skillful as ever. It was so skillful that it felt natural. It was so natural that it made people feel comfortable. Only Lu Yiqing, who was facing the blade, felt very uncomfortable and even uncomfortable. Ning Ke's movement was natural as he slashed forward. With a flick of his wrist, the majestic great spirit in his body flowed along the hilt and madly into the blade. Even if it was a treasured saber from the imperial palace, it would instantly disintegrate into countless metal fragments after being injected with so much great spirit. However, this new blade, which had been tempered by sixth brother and had the weight of 3 padeos, was able to withstand the pressure. The slender blade began to tremble at a terrifying speed that could not be seen by the naked eye, as if it would break at any time, or as if it would endure everything in silence forever. A buzzing sound. Previously, when Lu Yiqing had revealed his state, the black brick floor seemed to be spotless. However, at this time, the finest ash in the cracks of the black bricks was shaken out by Ning Ke's saber momentum and scattered in all directions. The people of Chang, and who were watching the battle, could not see what was happening at all. The scene in their eyes was still at the moment when Lu Yiqing's wind and thunder sword was about to pierce Ning Ke's face, and the saber in Ning Ke's hand was just an ordinary saber in the air. Only cultivators with a high state could clearly feel that there was a majestic aura of heaven and earth dancing around the padao in Ning Ke's hand. The amount and purity of this aura of heaven and earth was even more terrifying than the qi of heaven and earth absorbed by Lu Yiqing's wind and thunder sword. Chang Lishue also held onto the window with his right hand. His body was tense and his face was full of shock. He Mingqi, who was standing by the carriage, suddenly looked up and held the wheel with his right hand. The green leaves in the air that were crushed into powder by Lu Yiqing's sword style turned into nothingness when they touched the saber wind. A wildflower that was peeking out from the crack of the stone steps in the distance disappeared in an instant. Ning Ke's saber and Lu Yiqing's sword finally met. The saber momentum was so majestic that it suppressed the wind and thunder on the tip of Lu Yiqing's sword. It trembled uncontrollably, as if it was a candle in the wind that could be extinguished at any time. Lu Yiqing was shocked. He did not expect that Ning Ke, who was the weakest person on the second floor of the academy, and was even labeled as the shame of the academy by the Tao addict, could display such a powerful cultivation at this time. But he did not intend to retreat or stop his sword momentum. The sword in his hand was still moving forward. That was because he had been meditating at the side door of the academy for 3 months. He was fully prepared for what might happen in this duel, including Ning Ke's sudden increase in state after his hard cultivation. He firmly believed that when Ning Ke's saber and his sword met, there would definitely be a slight delay, because as long as one was human, he would definitely think. As long as he thought, Ning Ke would think of Chao Shaoshu from the sword in his hand. Why was Qiao Xiaoshu's sword in his hand? Did Qiao Xiaoshu really lose to him? Was Qiao Xiaoshu alive or dead? If Qiao Xiaoshu was alive, would Ning Ke still be able to cut him down with his saber? Weren't you worried that Qiao Xiaoshu would die with me after this cut? Did you think you could stop thinking by closing your eyes and not looking at the sword? Lu Yiqing thought coldly. He firmly believed that Ning Ke could think. Even if Ning Ke had an inhuman willpower and could ensure that there was no delay in the movement of the saber, there would definitely be a gap in his state of mind. When strong people fought, they fought for victory and defeat were often decided by a single thought. Lu Yiqing knew that he could seize the gap in Ning Ke's state of mind, and he had been preparing for this for a long time. However, Ning Ke's movement did not stop at all. He closed his eyes and chopped down in front of him with his saber. The chopping was so decisive and ruthless. His thoughts did not stop either. The reason why he closed his eyes was not because he did not want to see Qiao Xiaoshu's sword. He did not even think about whose sword it was. He did not even think that Qiao Xiaoshu might be dead or imprisoned in the sword garret. If he chopped down with his saber, Qiao Xiaoshu might really die. He did not think about anything. He just wanted to chop down the saber in his hand. This kind of thinking was very simple. Much simpler than Lu Yiqing's thinking. So much more powerful. The padao in Ning Ke's hand suddenly became brighter. Countless golden rays of light shot out from the dark blade. Like a sun leaping out of the sea of clouds, or like a burning cloud in the twilight. The golden rays shot out from the blade were gathered by Ning Ke's psyche power. They did not scatter around, but turned into a flame and hit Lu Yiqing's face directly. Chang Lishua's hands, which were holding the window frame, suddenly tightened and stood up in the carriage. With two cracking sounds, the window frame was smashed, and a big hole was made in the carriage. He Mingqi, who was standing beside the carriage, did not notice the movement behind him. His right hand, which was holding the wheel, was so nervous that his knuckles sank deep into the wheel, and sawdust flew everywhere. The two looked at the side door of the academy in shock and shouted in disbelief, "Divine skill!" A shrill scream came from the brick ground in front of the side door of the academy. Thousands of rays of light from Ning Ke's padao hit Lu Yiqing's face like flowing fire. The pure Haotian's divine flame reflected in his eyes, and then pierced into his sense of perception, causing him a sharp pain. However, his eyes felt real pain, and all light disappeared in an instant. The world became dark. No matter how strong his sword heart was, he could not help but lose focus, and the momentum of his sword was disrupted. The padao in Ning Ke's hand hit Lu Yiqing's sword. The momentum of the padao was overwhelming. The wind and thunder on the tip of Lu Yiqing's sword suddenly disappeared like smoke. The burning padao continued to cut down. The sword in Lu Yiqing's hand broke into countless pieces. The momentum of the padao continued. Ning Ke closed his eyes and struck. He only knew Lu Yiqing's original position. Therefore, when the padao fell, it did not hit Lu Yiqing's body, who was screaming and retreating, but hit the brick ground. But as long as it was cut down, it was enough. The burning padao hit the ground heavily, and countless sparks flew. The Haotian's divine flame on the padao suddenly exploded, turning into a terrifying aura of heaven and earth, and hit Lu Yiqing's body through the air. The wind was strong. In this extremely vast aura of heaven and earth, Lu Yiqing's body was like a sandbag in a hurricane, lightly flying up and landing heavily on the hard ground. He rolled a dozen times in a row in a sorry state, only stopping when he hit a peach tree at the foot of the hill. There was a cracking sound, and it was unknown whether it was the peach tree or his bones that broke. Lu Yiqing held the peach tree with his trembling right hand and stood up with difficulty. At this time his clothes were torn, and his body was covered in blood, stained with dust. It was a terrible sight. The peach blossoms that had bloomed for some time fell like rain, sprinkling on his body. The color was even thicker than the color of blood. The most terrifying thing was that his eyes looked as good as before, and even had the cold sword style from the beginning. However, looking at his blank expression, he could not see anything. After a moment, Lu Yiqing finally woke up from his muddle-headed state. Only when he was awake did he begin to feel fear, and because of the extreme fear he began to go crazy. He looked at the sky with his blank eyes, and held the remaining hilt of the sword tightly in his hand. as if holding the last life-saving straw. He kept waving it around crazily and shouted hoarsely, "How can you use divine skill? Who taught you divine skill? I will go to sleep after settling the accounts." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 403. It was dead silent outside the academy's side door. There was no sound outside the brick ground or the carriages by the side of the road. Only Lu Yiqing's shrill cries reverberated in the air. The cultivators from various sects were shocked speechless. From their point of view, Ning Ke had no reason to win today's battle, especially after Lu Yiqing revealed his powerful state before the battle. They thought that even if Ning Ke cultivated in seclusion at the back of the mountain of the academy, he would not be a match for this young powerhouse from the South Jin Kingdom. No one had expected that the battle would end so violently after it started so easily. The scene of Lu Yiqing flying out miserably happened right before their eyes. Could it be that this was the combination of talisman and martial arts that everyone had been talking about recently? Could it be that Ning Ke had really cultivated both talisman and martial arts in seclusion at the academy and had succeeded? The cultivators by the side of the road pondered in shock. The spectators outside the side door did not think much of it. They could not understand the battle between the two powerhouses. However, in the hearts of the ordinary Tangs, the students of the second floor of the academy were almost like gods. It was natural for them to defeat the swordsmen from the South Jin Kingdom. The reason why there was dead silence was because the battle had ended too quickly, and people did not have time to be excited. When they were about to cheer, they saw Lu Yiqing's miserable state and heard his crazed cries. The Tangs worshipped the strong and sympathized with the weak. They did not like this person from the South Jin Kingdom who dared to challenge the academy. However, when they saw the previously powerful opponent become blind and miserable, they could not help but feel pity for him. They all remained silent. "How do you know the divine skill?" Lu Yiqing stood under the peach tree and looked at the sky with listless eyes. He held the sword hilt tightly in his hand and was finally more clear-headed than before. His face was filled with fear and great unwillingness. He suddenly became angry again. He held the sword hilt and stabbed everywhere like a madman. He shouted, "I can't accept this. Ning Ke, where are you? Come and fight with me again." Lu Yiqing was indeed very unwilling, especially after he found out that he was blind. His unwillingness became even stronger, directly turning his sadness and helplessness into anger. He was the younger brother of Lu Bai, the Sage of Sword. He was destined to be the leader of the new generation of disciples in the Sword Garret of South Jin Kingdom. Even the second brother of the academy believed that he had the potential to catch up to Lu Bai. From the first simple stroke, it could be seen that his cultivation in sword Taoism was extremely terrifying. In terms of strength and state, he was definitely not weaker than Ning Quebec. Even if he might be defeated in the battle because of a momentary slip, he should not be defeated so miserably, and without the ability to fight back. Lu Yiqing used to think that the reason why Ning Ke could defeat Long Qing, Guan Hai and kill Dao Shi was not because he was stronger than them, but because he was lucky and cunning. He had been preparing for this battle for 3 months. Whether Ning Ke used the horrible iron arrow or the divine talisman left by Master Yen Sei, he had already prepared a way to deal with it. However, he did not expect Ning Ke to use a knife. From the beginning to the end of the battle, he only used his saber. He only used one stroke. Lu Yiqing believed that if Ning Ke had not hidden Haotian's divine light in his saber, he would not have been unprepared and lost so miserably. Looking at the dark night in front of him and recalling the process of the previous battle, he was filled with grief and indignation. He thought that if they fought again, he would definitely win. Lu Yiqing leaned against the peach tree, his listless eyes falling somewhere. He held the remaining hilt of his sword tightly in his hand and shouted to the hillside in a trembling voice, "Come on, let's fight again." Ning Ke looked at him quietly and suddenly said, "You have already lost. Why should I fight with you again?" Lu Yiqing heard his voice and quickly turned around. He looked over with his horrifying white eyes and almost fell down. He shouted, "Because you cheated, so I am not convinced." Ningke looked at him and said calmly, "How did I cheat?" Lu Yiqing's left hand trembled and stroked the rough trunk of the peach tree. He wanted to hold it tighter to make his body more stable. He said in a trembling voice, "This is the academy, and you?" Before he finished his words, Ningke interrupted him and asked, "The academy? Do you think I, a student of the second floor of the academy, have the geographical advantage? We are in the south of Chang and surrounded by tangs, so you have lost the harmony of the people. Or is it that today is the day I break out of seclusion, when my spirit is at its peak, so you have lost the timing?" Looking at the resentful expression on his face, Ningke sneered and said, "Don't forget that you have been waiting at the gate of the academy for 3 months. The whole world knows that you have been waiting for the day I break out of seclusion. So the location and the time of the battle are chosen by you. So why are you not convinced?" Lu Yiqing's body trembled slightly. The blood in his tattered coat mixed with dust and dripped to the ground. Ningke had never shown any mercy to his enemies. Although he had turned away from Sangsang today and did not take out that thing, which meant that he had spared his opponent's life in advance, his original purpose was to make his opponent suffer more than death. So how could he not suffer a mental blow after the victory? So, if you want to be dissatisfied, you should not be dissatisfied with me but with your stupid thinking ability. You shouldn't have blocked the gate of the academy and provoked our pride. You shouldn't have taken out Chao Xiaoshu's sword to provoke my killing intent. Hearing this, Lu Yiqing suddenly laughed crazily. Snot and tears flowed down his face. He pointed at Ningke with the sword hilt in his hand and shouted hoarsely, "I know you are cold-blooded and heartless, but I have underestimated how heartless you are. You clearly saw Chao Xiaoshu's sword in my hand, but you did not care about the safety of the person who once helped you. You did not even leave a gap in your mind. I have been practicing swordsmanship for many years, and I have a heart of steel. Today I have met someone colder than me. I should not be convinced that I have been defeated by you." The proud young powerhouse from the South Jin Kingdom finally admitted defeat for the first time after today's defeat. However, his words were still very bitter and full of despair and mockery. Ningke looked down at the dust on the bluestone bricks under his feet. He suddenly raised his head and looked at Lu Yiqing. He said, "First of all, Chao Xiaoshu and I are just acquaintances. We only talk about fried egg noodles and money. We don't talk about gratitude or hatred. Secondly, I don't know how his sword fell into your hands, but I know that an idiot like you can't possibly defeat him. What right do you have to use this sword to disturb my mind? What right do you have to be unconvinced? It's the toughest before the finish line of a marathon. I'm working hard. Let's start with 2000. The next chapter will be out before 1. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Qidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 404. Ningke walked towards the peach tree. Hearing the footsteps, Lu Yiqing became nervous. He held the hilt of his sword tighter and looked around in panic. He had said that he was unwilling to give up and wanted to fight again. However, when Ningke walked towards him, he realized that he was seriously injured and blind. He could not even defeat an ordinary person, let alone Ningquebec. Ningke stopped in front of Lu Yiqing and looked at his bloody and dirty face. He said, "I know you are still unwilling to give up, because you think that I hid my strength and was too cunning." Lu Yiqing's body trembled slightly. He pursed his lips tightly and used his strong willpower to stop himself from moaning in pain and falling unconscious because of his injuries. This young powerhouse from the South Jin Kingdom used his silence and posture to show that he was still unwilling to give up. Actually, that's because you don't know what a battle is. You thought your sword move was simple enough, but it wasn't simple at all. Because you thought about it for 3 whole months. You thought about how to deal with my arrows and talismans. You wanted to confuse me with words in Chao Xiaoshu. Ningke looked at him and said, "And I didn't use talismans or arrows. I didn't even use any skills. I didn't think about Chao Xiaoshu or the sword in your hand. I didn't care about the relationship between you and the Sage of Sword. I didn't fear you, I didn't despise you, I didn't use words to test your will to fight. And I didn't use any tricks to confuse you. I just pulled out the knife from the sheath and slashed at you." Lu Yiqing understood a little and his body trembled more violently. Ning Ke looked at him and said, "That's the real simple." After a moment of silence, Lu Yiqing said with a smile, "I understand." Ning Ke said mercilessly, "You don't understand at all. Simple thinking is the real simple. You thought too much. That's why you lost to me. And you said too much." Lu Yiqing leaned against the peach tree. His body shook and he almost fainted. Ning Ke didn't stop. He looked at him and continued, "Before the battle, you said that if I fought you with all my strength, you would tell me where Cao Xiaoshu was. That was a stupid thing to say." At this point, he paused for a moment and looked at the blood-like peach blossoms under Lu Yiqing's body. He said, "Even if you don't tell me where Cao Xiaoshu is, I will still beat you into a pile of dog shit. You threaten me just to make me more aware of the necessity of beating you into a pile of dog shit. Now that I have beaten you into a pile of dog shit, I'd like to see if you will tell me where Cao Xiaoshu is. I'd like to see how you can still be unconvinced." Lu Yiqing finally understood why he had lost today. Although he was still unwilling, he had no choice but to admit defeat. However, as he listened to his opponent's incessant taunts, describing him as a pile of dog shit, and then thought of his heavy injuries and blind eyes, he immediately felt resentment. After a moment, the resentment turned into helplessness. As the appointed leader of the Sword Garret of South Jin Kingdom, he had lost to his opponent in front of the world. Moreover, he was blind and would never be able to recover his cultivation state. He might not even be able to hold a sword again. How could he avenge himself in the future? The pride in Lu Yiqing's heart gradually disappeared after this fiasco and Ning Ke's calm, but ruthless post-battle analysis. He looked at the darkness in front of him and imagined the bleak future. His chest was filled with despair and his willpower suddenly collapsed. He leaned against the peach tree and sat down again. His right hand no longer had the strength to hold the sword hilt. Because Ning Ke's words destroyed the last straw, Ning Ke took a step forward and picked up the sword hilt. He looked at it silently for a long time. This was indeed Cao Xiaoshu's sword. Of course Cao Xiaoshu would not lose to someone like Lu Yiqing. Then why did his sword end up in the Sword Garret of South Jin Kingdom? During the battle, Ning Ke did not think about anything else in order to keep his state of mind clear and firm, and in order to make his chop as simple as possible. Now that the battle was over, those inauspicious judgments instantly poured into his mind, making his hand that was holding the hilt of the sword tremble slightly. After the bloody battle in the Spring Breeze Pavilion, many people in the world thought that Ning Ke and Cao Xiaoshu were close friends and very familiar with each other. That was why they could fight side by side while bathed in blood. However, Ning Ke knew that was not the case. The relationship between him and Cao Xiaoshu was that of the landlord and the tenant. It was like the relationship between the leader of the underworld in Chang and a hired killer. Or as he had said to Lu Yiqing, it was the relationship between a customer and a customer. The two of them could be described as romantic, but they had never talked about it. Most of the time they talked about money and fried egg noodles. That was why he and Cao Xiaoshu were not that close. They had only met a few times, and he had never even been to Cao Xiaoshu's home. However, there would always be one or two people in the world who came out of nowhere. They would casually walk into your life and say a few words to you. Then the two of them would live and die together. It was like when Cao Xiaoshu walked into the old brush pen shop on a rainy day. It was also like when Ning Ke and Zhuo Er met in the village in the Yan territory. This kind of relationship was very faint, so faint that they might not have any contact for many years. Sometimes they would occasionally exchange letters. Even if they met on a bustling night boat, they would just raise their cups of wine and talk about the matters after parting before parting again. This kind of relationship was very strong. It was so strong that when they met again after many years, they would look at each other on the street and smile. Then they would take the knife that the other person handed to them and fight against the endless enemies. And when you knew that the other person was in danger somewhere in the world and needed your help, no matter if you were taking the imperial examination or marrying a princess, you would throw away the brush in your hand without hesitation. You would tear up the examination paper on the table, push away the officials in charge of the palace examination, rush out of the imperial city, take off your new festive clothes, ignore the beautiful and shy bride by your bed, and ride a horse thousands of miles away. Ning Ke looked at the sword hilt in his hand and remained silent. He did not know where Cao Xiaoshu was now and what kind of situation he was facing. He suddenly realized that the fact that he was not familiar with Cao Xiaoshu was a beautiful premise. Because of this, he did not know if Cao Xiaoshu was a person who believed that as long as the sword existed, he would die. Because of this, he did not have to confirm that Cao Xiaoshu was dead. Ning Ke raised his head and looked at Lu Yiqing, who was sitting under the peach tree like a dead person. He tightened his grip on his knife and took another step forward. He slowly and firmly raised his knife. The audience exclaimed. They did not expect that Ning Ke would kill this man from the South Jin Kingdom. In the crowd, Professor Huang He frowned and shook his head worriedly, indicating that he should not act recklessly. I can only gnaw on it for 22,000 yuan. This is the hardest bone. The next chapter will be out before 3 o'clock. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Qidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 405. Ning Ke heard the exclamations of the crowd. As a Tang, he knew that it was not a glorious thing to kill an enemy after he had surrendered. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Professor Huang He's worried expression and shaking his head. He knew what the professor was worried about. If he killed Lu Yiqing under such circumstances, it would be equivalent to forming an unresolvable feud with the sword Garrett of South Jin Kingdom, especially with the world's most powerful sage of sword, Liu Bai. Ning Ke had never thought of killing Lu Yiqing, because he wanted the South Jin Kingdom to live a life worse than death. Now that Lu Yiqing was blind, he was satisfied with the result. But he looked at Lu Yiqing, who was sitting under the peach tree with a pale face. He slowly and firmly raised his padao, as if he was going to chop down at the next moment. That was because he was very clear on one thing. Even those who had fallen into a situation worse than death still didn't want to die. Otherwise, there wouldn't be such a situation in the world. The more determined and powerful a person was, the more they believed that they could escape from this predicament, and the more greedy they were for life. Lu Yiqing looked miserable and desperate. But there was no doubt that he was a man with a strong will, so he definitely did not want to die. Ning Ke wanted him to feel that he was going to die soon so that he could achieve his goal. As expected, Lu Yiqing felt the cold knife style coming from above his head. He felt Ning Ke's undisguised killing intent. His body suddenly stiffened and he said hoarsely, "You want to kill me? As long as the sword lives, the man lives. If the sword dies, the man dies." Ning Ke said, "Cao Xiaoshu's sword is in your hands, so he must be dead. Since I have broken the sword, would I let you who killed him live?" Lu Yiqing felt fear. He struggled for a moment and said, "I did not kill Cao Xiaoshu." Ning Ke looked at him and said, "With your cultivation state, you could not hurt Cao Xiaoshu. But who knows if you used any dirty tricks?" Lu Yiqing smiled nervously and said, "Cao Xiaoshu has already entered the knowing destiny state. Do you think those dirty tricks can be used against him?" Ning Ke said, "But his sword is in your hands. Since we all agree that Cao Xiaoshu is strong enough, there seems to be only one possibility." Lu Yiqing seemed to have thought of something. He suddenly became nervous and did not want to say another word. Ning Ke said after a moment of silence, "Liu Bai did it himself?" Lu Yiqing did not answer his question. Ning Ke looked up at the peach branch with broken petals and suddenly said, "Tell me what happened at that time. Tell me Cao Xiaoshu's current situation, and I won't kill you." Lu Yiqing frowned and fell into an intense struggle. Right at this moment, a clamor suddenly arose from the nearby crowd, and the faint sound of an intense argument could be heard. Hearing the voice, Lu Yiqing was slightly refreshed and looked up. His eyes were blinded by Hao Yin's divine light, and became even more terrifying because of his pride. He gritted his teeth and said coldly, "Do you still dare to challenge my brother?" Ning Ke looked at him and shook his head. He said, "Liu Bai belongs to my second brother, not me. Of course, if Liu Bai is beaten into a pile of dog shit by my second brother, I don't mind stepping on him." Hearing this, Lu Yiqing's face twisted in shock. In his entire life, he had never heard anyone dare to mention his elder brother in such a tone. His elder brother was the strongest person in the world, the Sword Saint Liu Bai. No matter if it was an enemy or a friend, when the Sword Saint Liu Bai was mentioned, they would involuntarily show some respect. Who dared to say that the Sword Saint Liu Bai would be beaten into a pile of dog shit by someone like Ning Ke? Some time had passed since the end of the battle. The onlookers saw Ning Ke walk to Lu Yiqing, but they could not hear what they were saying. They only saw Ning Ke's posture of wanting to kill Lu Yiqing, so they exclaimed. The Divine Hall's ambassadors and the sects by the side of the road were all silent. The South Jin Kingdom's ambassador and 2 disciples of the Sword Garret ran down the hill in a panic, wanting to stop this from happening. The Yulin royal guards had already pulled up a long rope to guard the side gate of the academy. Other than the 2 participants in the duel, no one was allowed to enter. Both sides immediately quarreled fiercely. The South Jin Kingdom's ambassador said angrily, "We admit defeat if we lose, but why won't you let us in to treat Master Lu? What are you Tangs trying to do?" The Tang Empire was the most powerful country, followed by the South Jin Kingdom. Therefore, the people of the South Jin Kingdom were used to seeing the Tangs as opponents. However, the Tangs did not even care about the South Jin Kingdom. The Yulin royal guards were the proudest group of people in Chang, and they even turned a blind eye to the ambassador's anger. The conversation about Cao Xiaoshu was between Ning Ke and Lu Yiqing, so they did not purposely raise their volume. Therefore, the onlookers of Chang, and the students of the academy did not hear it. However, the cultivators in the horse carriages by the side of the road heard it clearly. Cao Xiaoshu's name used to only be famous in the underworld of Jianghu. However, after the battle at the Spring Breeze Pavilion, his name suddenly spread throughout the cultivation world. Only then did all the sects know that there was a hidden powerhouse in the Tang Empire, and that this powerhouse had entered the knowing destiny state not long after. Cao Xiaoshu had actually been killed or imprisoned by the Sword Garret of the South Jin Kingdom. The cultivators of the various sects knew the story of the Spring Breeze Pavilion, so they naturally thought that they understood Ning Ke's anger. They understood why he raised his knife and was ready to chop off Lu Yiqing's head. However, they did not think that it would be the right decision for Ning Ke to kill Lu Yiqing. What had happened to Cao Xiaoshu was only Lu Yiqing's own words. The Sword Garret of the South Jin Kingdom could completely deny it, because no one had any evidence. However, Lu Yiqing's blindness and severe injuries were witnessed by thousands of people. Under Haoyan, no matter how tyrannical the Tangs were, they could not stop the South Jin Kingdom from treating Lu Yiqing's injuries and taking him away. However, it was obvious that Ning Ke was not going to let Lu Yiqing leave the academy alive. Ning Ke held his knife. Lu Yiqing lowered his head, as if he was waiting for death. However, he was actually listening to the movements outside. The South Jin Kingdom envoy roared angrily at the soldiers of the Yulin royal guards. The 2 disciples of the Sword Garret looked extremely angry, as if they were ready to pull out their swords from the sheaths at their waists. The atmosphere in the field became unusually tense because of the confrontation. At this moment, a voice came from the side door of the academy, which had been silent for a long time. The voice was calm and serious. It sounded gentle, but there was an unquestionable meaning in it. This person has been meditating outside the academy for 3 months. His willpower and perseverance are commendable. It is already impolite of us to not invite him into the academy. Today he is seriously injured and blind. How can he withstand such a long journey? If we leave him to fend for himself, it would be against the harmony of heaven. It is not how we treat our guests. Youngest brother, why don't you bring him into the academy and treat him properly? Everyone was confused when they heard this. They wondered what this person was trying to say after saying so much correct nonsense. When they heard that this person wanted to bring Lu Yiqing into the academy, they could not help but burst into an uproar. There were many wonderful people in the academy. However, there was only one person who could use such a serious tone to say such correct nonsense. He was so unreasonable that he wanted to lock Lu Yiqing in the academy. Of course it was second brother. Ning Ke smiled when he heard second brother's words and put his padao back into its sheath. Professor Huang he smiled bitterly and shook his head. He thought that this matter would become more and more troublesome. The duel that Lu Yiqing, the younger brother of the Sword Sage of South Jin Kingdom, and Mr. 13 of the Academy Ning Ke had prepared for 3 months had ended. The onlookers gradually dispersed. Their faces were still filled with longing because they were only mortals and could not see the details of the battle between these cultivators. In their eyes, the battle had ended with Lu Yiqing stabbing and Ning Ke chopping. Not understanding did not mean that they would not talk about it. This was destined to be the most sensational duel in the world in recent times. It would definitely be retold by the people of Chang'an, and eventually become a more exciting and thrilling legend that was completely different from the real situation. In the days to come, there would definitely be many people discussing Ning Ke's simple and unparalleled slash in the wine shops and sects deep in the mountains. And it might even become a distant memory of the people in Chang'an. Dozens of horse carriages on the official road gradually left the academy. Only the horse carriage that belonged to the West Hill Divine Palace's diplomatic corps was still there, looking a little lonely. Chang Lishua did not leave. He walked out of the broken carriage and came to He Mingqi's side. He looked down at the side door of the academy, his brows full of confusion. The side door of the academy was tightly shut. There were some bloodstains on the green brick ground in front of the door. There were several short ridges formed by dust around it. They had previously proved Lu Yiqing's strength, but now they seemed a little ridiculous. Is it really possible to cultivate in talisman and martial arts at the same time? Chang Lishua frowned and looked in that direction, thinking hard. As the priest of the Revelation Department of the West Hill Divine Palace, he had a profound state of Taoism and was even more knowledgeable. However, he had never read about cultivating in talisman and martial arts at the same time in any ancient books. Of course, he had never heard of anyone successfully cultivating it. Even if you cultivated in seclusion in the cliff cave for 3 months and combined the two into one, why did you use my West Hill divine skill when you chopped at the end? Chang Lishua asked himself a question. This was the same question that Lu Yiqing had asked in a trembling voice when he was blinded and in a panic. How could Ning Ke know divine skill? Who taught him divine skill? He Mingqi, who was standing beside him in silence, seemed to have heard the voice deep in his heart. He said softly, Ning Ke is a student of the headmaster of the academy. Then everything is possible. According to the records of the West Hill Divine Palace and the descriptions of the divine priests on the Peach Mountain, the headmaster of the academy seemed to be an omnipotent person. Chang Lishua felt that this inference was valid, but vaguely felt that this matter was not so simple. He thought of the little girl he saw just now, the little girl standing under the shadow of the big green tree. Then he seemed to understand. Dawn is ahead, I will eat first. The next chapter will be out before 4:50. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 406. The West Hill Divine Skill was the most sacred and supreme Taoist magic of Haotian Taoism. It was even called the origin of Taoist magic. Different from the divine skill used by the deacons of the judicial department who patrolled the world, this divine skill was not a specific cultivation method, but a divine weapon given by Haotian to the cultivators. The disciples of Haotian Taoism who could practice the divine skills on Peach Mountain did not necessarily have the highest aptitude for comprehension, but they must have the purest Taoist heart and the strongest faith in Haotian. Yi Hongyu, the Tao addict, was able to cultivate the divine skills because she had done these two things. Prince Longqing's faith in Haotian was firm enough, but he could not keep his Taoist heart clear because of the royal affairs of the Yan Kingdom, so even he could not cultivate the real divine skills. For some reason, Chang Lishua could not cultivate divine arts either. Therefore, he could not understand why Ning Ke could do it. Until he remembered the little girl who had been standing quietly under the big tree. He recognized the little girl because she was the reason and purpose why the great divine priest of Revelation led the West Hill Diplomatic Corps to Chang'an. So he thought he had guessed the truth. There was a courtyard deep in the wetland of the academy. Ning Ke and Chan Pippi stood on the bank of the wetland outside the courtyard. Perhaps it was because Tang Xiaotang was asked to practice by senior sister Yu Lian. Chan Pippi was silent. He lowered his head and stared blankly at the water plants in the wetland. After some time, he suddenly raised his head and said to Ning Ke, "That divine light came from the blade. Ning Ke knew what he wanted to express. After a moment of silence he said, "Special Taoism?" Chun Pippi shook his head and said, "The West Hill divine skill is not like this." Ning Ke frowned slightly and said, "I used a divine talisman to inject Hao Yin's divine flame into the blade. That's why the divine flame came out of the blade when I waved it. What do you think of this explanation?" "Nothing much." Chun Pippi reminded him seriously. "In the beginning, your blade was wrapped with the chi of heaven and earth. It's my first time. I don't have any experience." Ning Ke said sincerely, "There will be no such loopholes in the future." Chun Pippi mocked, "Do you really think you can deceive the world for a lifetime?" Ning Ke asked, "Even if they sense something wrong, who can find evidence for this?" Chun Pippi thought about it and shook his head. "Not really." Ning Ke relaxed and said, "That's good." Right at this moment, a shrill and miserable howl suddenly resounded in the courtyard. And then the howl came to an abrupt end. Silence ensued, and the two of them looked at each other before turning around and walking into the courtyard. In a secluded room in the courtyard, the old woman in the blue gown looked at Lu Yiqing, who was rolling on the bed in pain. She shook her head and put away the needles and other medical items in her hand, saying, "I can't do it anymore." Second brother nodded slightly and said, "Thank you." The door was pushed open and Ning Ke and Chun Pippi walked in. Lu Yiqing gritted his teeth and endured the pain in his eyes. His left hand tightly gripped the wooden bar beside the bed and shouted, "What the hell do you want to do?" White bandages were wrapped around his injured eyes. Ning Ke looked at him and said, "You should be very clear." Hearing Ning Ke's voice, Lu Yiqing's face, which was not covered by the white bandages, revealed a vicious expression. He said in a slightly hoarse voice, "You blinded my eyes today, and I will definitely pay you back in the future." Ning Ke had always been a person who refused to be at a disadvantage, whether it was in a sword fight or a verbal battle. Hearing this person threatening him, he said, "If you really want to take revenge, why wait until the future? You can kill me now because you know that I really want to kill you." Lu Yiqing did not expect that he would use words to express his killing intent. After a slight stiffening, he said in a cold voice, "My eldest brother is the Sage of Sword, Lu Bai. How dare you kill me?" Cultivators paid attention to their state of mind and willpower. Once they started to reveal their background, except for people like Ning Ke who did not care about manners, most people would feel desperate or even collapse. However, Lu Yiqing did have some hope and confidence. The Sage of Sword Lu Bai was indeed too famous. Although the Academy would not be afraid of him, it seemed unnecessary to provoke the world's strongest powerhouse. At this time, second brother, who had been standing quietly, suddenly said, "Since you are Lu Bai's younger brother, the Academy will not treat you harshly. Please rest assured." Lu Yiqing knew that the owner of this voice must have a high status in the Academy. He might even be the rumored Mr. First or Mr. Second at the back of the mountain of the Academy. He sincerely said, "Thank you for your care." "You're welcome." He was not being polite, but because second brother was an upright gentleman and did not want to lie. Moreover, he did not think that what he had done was worthy of being thanked. He said, "Because I plan to let you stay in the Academy to recuperate." Lu Yiqing was stunned and asked with the last hope, "Then when are you willing to let me go?" Second brother thought for a moment and said honestly, "I will let you go when Lu Bai releases Cao Xiaoshu. If Cao Xiaoshu is dead, then you will never have to leave." Lu Yiqing heard the seriousness in second brother's words. The pain in his eyes and the fear of being imprisoned in the Academy made him even more panicked. He said anxiously, "Cao Xiaoshu is really not in the sword garret. He is not dead. Eldest brother is in seclusion, so I could only take his sword and hurt him." Then he ran away. Ning Ke finally knew that Cao Xiaoshu had met the Sage of Sword Lu Bai. Ning Ke finally knew that Cao Xiaoshu had indeed encountered the Sage of Sword Lu Bai. Naturally, he was no match for him. No wonder his sword was taken away. But how serious was his injury? Second brother suddenly asked, "How can you prove it?" The room was silent. Lu Yiqing said, "Isn't it proof that Cao Xiaoshu is not in the sword garret?" Second brother said, "How can you prove that Cao Xiaoshu is not in the sword garret? How can you prove that he is still alive?" Lu Yiqing thought that no one knew where Cao Xiaoshu was. How could he prove it? The more he thought, the more anxious he became. He said, "How can the academy be so unreasonable?" Second brother said calmly, "A debt must be paid. A life must be paid for a life. A prisoner must be kept alive. You can only leave when Lu Bai can prove that Cao Xiaoshu is not with him and is still alive." The old woman in the blue coat said lightly, "I will write a letter to Lu Bai and ask." Second brother was slightly stunned and said, "Thank you." Walking out of the courtyard and to the wetland, Ning Ke could not suppress his curiosity. He wanted to ask second brother about the relationship between the old professor who liked to clean the academy and Lu Bai. Unexpectedly, second brother did not give him a chance to speak. He patted his shoulder with a smile and said, "Not bad." Second brother had always been a serious and courteous person. He paid particular attention to filial piety and fraternity. He treated his teacher as warm as spring, eldest brother as warm as summer, younger brothers and sisters as cold as autumn, and his enemies as cold as winter. He rarely smiled or praised people like Ning Ke and the others. Therefore, looking at the smile on senior brother's face, hearing the two words "not bad," and feeling the strength from his shoulder, Ning Ke's legs gave way and he almost fell to the ground. He felt extremely comfortable. Chun Pippi pursed his lips enviously. Second brother turned around to look at Chun Pippi. The smile on his face had long disappeared. He said seriously, "Although you entered the academy earlier than youngest brother and have a higher cultivation state, you are not as good as him in some aspects. As the saying goes, there is an order to understand the Tao. When you get the Tao, you have to forget your identity as senior brother and learn from him." Chun Pippi thought, "When did you forget your identity as senior brother to learn from me? And what do I, a genius, need to learn from Ning Ke?" Although he thought so in his heart, he showed a respectful expression and repeatedly agreed. Ning Ke asked a little unconfidently, "Senior brother, what's good about me?" Second brother looked at him with satisfaction and said, "Finally, you told that person that one day, I will beat Lu Bai into a pile of dog shit. Such foresight and courage are very good." After a moment, Chun Pippi looked at second brother's back and said faintly, "I thought you wanted me to learn something. It turns out that you just like to flatter me." Ning Ke patted his shoulder and comforted him. "It's all knowledge, all knowledge." In Chang'an, the Southern Gate Temple in front of the imperial city was as quiet as usual. However, compared to the past, the quietness of the Southern Gate Temple was more tense and somber today. There was no one walking in the beautiful Taoist temple complex, but in the streets outside the Taoist temple, there were many experts from the Tang military and the Imperial Center administration hiding. Recently, the defense of the Southern Gate Temple was even tighter than that of the Imperial Palace. It was not the Imperial Court's fault for being nervous. It was because the bigwig who lived in the Southern Gate Temple was too respected. If anything happened to the bigwig in the Tang Empire, the whole world would probably fall into the flames of war. The great divine priest of revelation of the West Hill Divine Palace lived here. In the Taoist temple deep in the Southern Gate Temple, an old man in a gorgeous divine robe sat in the depths of the dark wooden floor. His closed eyes were surrounded by wrinkles like dry land. Chang Lishue, the priest of the Revelation Department, knelt respectfully in front of the old man. When junior brother Long Qing was destroyed by him, the Divine Hall thought that it was because of the terrifying divine item provided by the academy. Even when Monk Guanhai and Dao Shi were defeated by him, no one thought that he was very strong. Chang Lishue organized the words in his heart. After a short pause, he continued respectfully, "Today, I watched his battle with Lu Yiqing and confirmed that he should have entered the upper see-through state. Compared to when we met in the wilderness, his cultivation state is improving at a terrifying speed." The person who could make Chang Lishue so respectful was naturally the great divine priest of revelation. The great divine priest of revelation slowly opened his eyes. The deep wrinkles at the corners of his eyes gradually stretched out as he opened his eyes. It was like a dry land that was moistened by the spring rain for a night. The headmaster returned to the academy and can personally guide him. If his cultivation state still improves at the speed of an ordinary person, then it will be truly terrifying. The great divine priest of revelation looked at his disciple in front of him and asked, But why is he able to cultivate the divine skill? Chang Lishua said, I am wondering if it has something to do with junior sister Sangsang. The great divine priest of revelation looked at him quietly and said, How can you prove it? Actually, I am in a very bad state today because of some things. But when I wrote this chapter I was very happy. When second brother said how to prove it, there is still one more chapter. I will continue. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 407. Chang Lishua shook his head after a moment of hesitation. The great divine priest of revelation recalled what had happened many years ago and said indifferently, Then do you know that Mr. Ku from the academy once showed his divine skills to the world? Chang Lishua was shocked speechless. He was already confused that there was someone else who could cultivate the divine skill other than the West Hill Divine Palace. He could barely accept what had happened to Ning Ke because of Sangsang. But now he heard from the great divine priest that someone in the academy had already mastered the divine skill many years ago. This was really unacceptable, even if that person was the legendary Mr. Ku. The great divine priest of revelation said, Whether Ning Ke learned the West Hill divine skill from Sangsang or found the key from Mr. Ku's legacy, it made no difference to Haotian Taoism. But Mr. Ku's faith in Haotian can't be so firm. How could he cultivate the divine skill? If Ning Ke learned the divine skill from Mr. Ku, what is it exactly? Chang Lishua said blankly, Even if Ning Ke is Uncle Yensei's disciple, we still have to be more vigilant. What is faith? This is a very complicated question in itself. As for what is called firmness, that is something that only the great Hao Tian can judge for himself. The great divine priest of revelation said indifferently, Your question is not the responsibility of the revelation department. It is a question of the judicial department. Write a letter to the West Hill later, and let them handle it themselves. Chang Lishua nodded and thought of the message from the West Hill a few days ago. He frowned slightly and said, I heard that the great divine priest of judgment has not recovered from his injury. Recently, his mood. The great divine priest of revelation looked into his eyes and said, The 3 departments of the divine hall each have their own responsibilities. You'd better stay away from the judicial department. Don't dirty yourself with that basin of dirty water. Chang Lishua heard this and asked in surprise, I don't understand. The great divine priest of revelation looked at the dark floor in front of him, as if he was looking at the dark prison in the depths of Peach Mountain. He sighed and said, When the judicial department instructed Qingguan Taoism to publicize Liu Bai's name, they wanted to make the sword Garrett angry. Today's battle at the gate of the academy started because of this. Even the key points were planned by the judicial department. However, these people who are used to conspiracies and violence never understand that this is a matter between the academy and Liu Bai. It is wrong for the divine hall to intervene. The more they do, the more mistakes they will make. It was only then that Chang Lishua realized that the West Hill Divine Palace had done something behind the scenes. The great divine priest of revelation lowered his eyes slightly, and the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes deepened. He said slowly, Senior brother Guang is gone, and I am old. Seeing that something big is about to happen in the judicial department, I feel a little uneasy. Chang Lishua asked nervously, Since we already knew that something big was going to happen, why can't we stop it in advance? The great divine priest of revelation raised his head and looked at him lovingly. He said, You have followed me for more than 20 years, and you have been in the revelation department for a long time. Don't you know that the so-called revelation is just an order from heaven? We may know some things in advance, but that is what Haotian wants us to know. Stop it in advance? Wouldn't that be against heaven? What's more, the event of the judicial department might not be a bad thing for the divine hall. The Jishou Abbey was an unknown place. Not many people knew of the existence of this dilapidated Taoist temple. Even those who knew of the existence of the Jishou Abbey did not know that this Taoist abbey, which was high up in the clouds of Haotian Taoism, was in a deep mountain not far from Peach Mountain, quietly looking at the magnificent and solemn Taoist temples. In the first thatched hut by the lake behind the Taoist temple, The lake breeze blew through the window again, opened the cover of the hand scroll of the Tomes of Arcane, and stopped on a certain page. The middle-aged Taoist by the table looked at the name on the page in silence. The middle-aged Taoist had been in charge of the Tomes of Arcane for many years, but he had never seen such a thing happen on the hand scroll. 3 months ago the name disappeared. Yesterday that name appeared again, but it did not appear in its original place. Instead it was flipped by the lake wind. Sometimes it appeared on the previous page, and sometimes it appeared on the next page. It did not stop until it finally returned to the first page, but its position had changed. The name suddenly appeared on the top of the book from an inconspicuous corner, like a firework rising from the wilderness, and was about to touch the sky in an instant. From the lower see-through state, you are about to see the threshold of the knowing destiny state. The headmaster of the academy is really amazing. The middle-aged Taoist looked at the restless name and said with a smile, I have been in charge of the Tomes of Arcane for many years. Your speed of improvement can be ranked in the top 5, but your elusiveness is definitely the first. Not far away, the name of Prince Long Qing was as faint as usual, but the last stroke of the word Qing seemed to be thicker than before, as if someone had added a stroke of ink. The middle-aged Taoist did not notice the change of Prince Long Qing's name. All his attention was on the restless name. Then, he looked up at the top of the Tomes of Arcane and nodded with satisfaction. The name Yi Hongyu was hanging there, as if it could break out of the paper at any time. It looked extremely aloof and arrogant, leaving all the other names on the page far behind. Between the cliffs of the Peach Mountain of West Hill that seemed to have been split by a divine axe, there was a Taoist temple made of countless huge black rocks. A green figure stood quietly at the stone steps in front of the temple, looking extremely small. After returning from the wilderness, it was unknown whether it was because she was tired of the blood-like red, or because she wanted to cover the 2 horrible wounds on her shoulders. Yi Hongyu was no longer wearing the beautiful bright red dress. Instead, she wore a loose green Taoist robe like the lowliest Taoist servant in the Divine Hall. The deacons of the judicial department of the Divine Hall looked at her in front of the temple with complicated expressions. There were despise, sadness, pity, mockery, disdain, and anger. Most of them were negative emotions. In the past, she was the Grand Master of the judicial department and above all others. She was the Tao addict who was praised by the entire Haotian Taoism. She was proud and indifferent. Although she handed over the specific affairs of the judicial department to Prince Long Qing to handle, she would not show mercy when her subordinate deacons made a mistake. At that time, everyone in the judicial department was in awe of her because of her coldness and strength. But now, everyone knew that the Tao addict was no longer the Tao addict of the past. She was no longer powerful, so she was no longer cold. Therefore, no one was in awe of her anymore. They even deliberately looked at her with mockery because of some kind of emotion. For the Ming hand scroll of the Tomes of Arcane, the West Hill Divine Palace had invested a lot of manpower in the wilderness last year. The specific affairs were handled by the judicial department. In other words, it was Yi Hongyu who was in charge. The judicial department had planned for a long time, but in the end they failed miserably. From the commander of the cavalrymen of the Divine Hall to the strange disappearance of the 2 black deacons, the destruction of Prince Long Qing, and the failure to snatch the Tomes of Arcane, the judicial department, which used to be cold and powerful, actually seemed so weak. No one in the Divine Hall cared about the fight for the Ming hand scroll of the Tomes of Arcane. In the end, it had long been out of the scope of cultivation power in the world. It had evolved into a story among the world wayfarers of the Academy and other unknown places. Now, Yi Hongyu was not qualified to participate in that level of battle. She should not participate in that level of battle. Everyone thought that since Yi Hongyu was the Grand Master of the judicial department, then the failure was her responsibility. The West Hill Divine Palace believed in the light of Haotian. However, the Taoism Hall was not necessarily completely bright, especially when the judicial department walked in the dark and worshipped power the most. Therefore, as long as Yi Hongyu was still the powerful Tao addict of the West Hill Divine Palace, then these things would not affect her at all. The problem was that Yi Hongyu herself had a problem. During the trip to the wilderness, she met the terrifying Master Lotus at the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine. He used the practice of Taotai to devour her flesh and blood. At the moment of life and death, she used the secret method of Haotian Taoism to forcefully lower her state in exchange for a moment of powerful brilliance. Finally, she joined hands with Ning Ke and Mo Shanshan to walk back from the brink of death. However, she had just entered the knowing destiny state in the snow cliff. Before her state had stabilized, she forcefully lowered her state again, which caused an even more terrifying counterattack. Since leaving the wilderness, her state had been constantly falling, and she could not even stay at the upper see-through state. According to the current trend, she might fall to the lower see-through state or even lower levels before her cultivation could finally stabilize. What was more terrifying was that she might not have any hope of returning to the knowing destiny state in this lifetime. If the Tao addict was no longer powerful, would she still be the Tao addict? The people of the judicial department who respected power naturally did not respect her as they used to. However, Yi Hongyu became more and more silent and calm in the face of the changes in her body. She moved into a quiet and remote stone house, as if she wanted to send a message to everyone by doing so. However, the more she did so, the more people felt that she was no longer qualified to be respected. The people in the West Hill Divine Palace looked at her with more and more complicated expressions. The ridicule in many people's eyes became more and more obvious. There was even a saying in the judicial department: Prince Longqing was dead, and so was the Tao addict. The girl in green standing in front of the hall was just a good-for-nothing named Yi Hongyu. A deacon walked out of the judicial temple and gently invited her in. Yi Hongyu nodded slightly and then calmly walked into the Black Taoist temple. The interior of the Black Taoist temple was spacious, and there was a curtain woven from pearls and jade in the deepest part. Yi Hongyu walked very slowly, and it took her a long time to reach the curtain. Behind the curtain was the divine throne carved from a whole piece of South Sea ink jade. The color of the jade was like solidified blood. The great divine priest of judgment sat on the divine throne with her hand on her forehead. She seemed to be resting and did not speak. Yi Hongyu stood quietly outside the curtain and did not speak either. There was not even a trace of wind in the spacious Taoist temple. The silence continued. She understood something. Then she slowly lifted the front of her green Taoist robe and knelt in front of the great divine priest of judgment. Everyone in the judicial department had to kneel before the great divine priest of judgment to show their obedience and respect. In the past, only the Tao addict could not kneel because she was proud and powerful. But she was not the Tao addict now, so she had to kneel, and she had to kneel more respectfully than others. Blowing kisses, blowing kisses. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 408. I recommend a new book, The Spear Breaks the World. Book number 2346448. The author Yang Jialong once participated in the book review contest of The Coming Night. He wrote The Coming Night finale and won the second prize. Please support him. The great divine priest of judgment, who was sitting on the black jade throne, slowly opened his eyes and looked at the girl kneeling outside the curtain. His face was expressionless, but his eyes seemed to hide many complicated emotions. After a long time, the great divine priest of judgment said coldly, "Although you have become a useless person now, I hope you still have your vision." The voice was slightly hoarse, calm and elegant, but there was a hint of violence that could not be hidden. It directly shook the bead curtain in front of the throne. The clear sound echoed in the empty Taoist hall, like a rainstorm falling into an empty porcelain bowl. Yi Hongyu quietly knelt in front of the curtain. She was not moved by the noise and the power contained in the voice. She just lowered her head and appeared more respectful. A deacon from the judicial department came out from behind the curtain with a file in his hands. He walked to her, smiled gently and comforted her, and then handed the file to her. Yi Hongyu took the scroll quietly. She did not get up and continued to kneel. She carefully read the contents of the scroll, and then fell into a long period of thought. The file was sent back to the West Hill by the Divine Hall's diplomatic corps to the Tang Empire. The writer was Priest Chang Lishue of the Revelation Department. The content of the file was a detailed description of the battle between Ning Ke and Lu Yiqing at the side door of the academy. The focus of the description was, of course, on the divine skill that Ning Ke revealed at the end. You have seen that person. What do you think? The cold and solemn voice of the great divine priest of judgment sounded again from behind the bead curtain. Yi Hongyu listened quietly to the sound of the bead curtains hitting against each other. She said slowly, Ning Ke's cultivation state is so fast that it has exceeded my expectations. As for the divine skill that the revelation department thought of, it seems to me that it is just a facade. Because according to the details, the Haotian divine flame that Ning Ke condensed from the qi of heaven and earth should have burst out from within the blade and not from nature. There was a dead silence in the Taoist hall. Through the details of the file, Yi Hongyu had some doubts about the real means of Ning Ke's knife. This doubt pointed to a very shocking fact, so there was a silence. After a long time, the great divine priest of judgment asked in a low voice, "Are you sure?" Yi Hongyu shook her head and said, "Back then, Mr. Ku had also shown his divine skills to the world. Furthermore, since Ning Ke's handmaiden had become a disciple of the divine priest of light, no one would suspect him without evidence. Even if they did, they would not be able to tell the world about it." The great divine priest of judgment looked at her, who was kneeling in front of him expressionlessly. Yi Hongyu calmly said, "I can do." The great divine priest of judgment looked at the girl's tranquil expression and felt a sense of impatience in his chest. He said angrily, "Then what is the use of you?" Yi Hongyu said after a moment of silence, "At least you have good taste." A deep thunderous cough suddenly sounded from behind the bead curtain and could not be stopped. After a long time, the great divine priest of judgment stopped coughing and looked at her coldly through the bead curtain. He said, "Your body has been polluted by that devil lotus. You need to be purified. It is a good choice to choose the stone house to practice hard and hide from the world. During this time, don't bother with the affairs of the department." Yi Hongyu knew very well that the great divine priest's simple words were equivalent to stripping her of her position as the Grand Master of the judicial department. In fact, ever since she returned from the wilderness, she had lived in seclusion in the stone house and rarely cared about the affairs of the judicial department. However, ignoring and being deprived of the right to care were two different things. Now her strength was seriously damaged and her realm had fallen to the middle level of see-through, and it was still going down. If even the position of the priest of the judicial department no longer existed, then the people in the divine hall who had suffered countless hardships in front of her might turn those mocking and contemptuous eyes into real actions. Yi Hongyu knelt in front of the great god's throne and remained silent. The great divine priest of judgment leaned back tiredly and supported his forehead with his hand. He looked at the girl outside the curtain with a trace of boredom and mockery in his deep eyes. As a giant of the divine hall, he absolutely could not accept that someone tried to maintain pride in front of the great god and refused to kneel down humbly. In the past years, because of Yi Hongyu's talent, the hierarch appreciated her, and he also thought highly of her. Together with the person in the temple, he could calmly watch her pride and even support her pride. But now, since she did not have the right to be proud, then let her be silent. "I have written a letter to the temple about this matter. Your brother expressed his gratitude to me for handling it." The great divine priest of judgment looked at the girl outside the curtain indifferently, shattering her last psychological dependence. Sure enough, after hearing this, Yi Hongyu's expression became a little gloomy. Her body trembled slightly, and her eyebrows were full of self-mockery and disappointment. She was like a seemingly hard egg that finally had its thin outer shell broken, revealing the fragile inside. After an unknown amount of time, she seemed to finally wake up. A sad smile appeared on her face as she bowed to the god behind the bead curtain and said, "All these years, it is all thanks to the god's protection that I have today. Please allow this disciple to thank you for your great kindness." The great divine priest of judgment frowned and looked at the girl who bowed in front of the curtain. He suddenly felt that his decision seemed to be a little hasty. He always felt that the sad smile on the girl's lips, and the words that sounded a little desperate and sad, hid some meaning that he did not understand. After bowing, Yi Hongyu slowly stood up. Just before leaving, she looked at the great god on the black jade seat behind the curtain and said softly, This is between the Sword Garret of South Jin Kingdom and the Academy. I think it is better for the judicial department not to interfere, even though this is something to be said after the fact. The great divine priest of judgment looked at her and suddenly coughed painfully again. He sternly scolded, "It is not terrible that your state has fallen. It is terrible that your Taoist heart is so timid. The West Hill Divine Palace rules the world, and the judicial department enforces the rules. Who dares to question this?" Yi Hongyu said no more and walked out of the Black Taoist temple. Standing at the top of the high stone steps outside the Taoist temple, she looked at the smoke in the fields outside the Peach Mountain. After a moment of silence, she suddenly sighed and said, "Someone is going to die again." The deacon who had handed her the dossier had accompanied her all the way to the outside of the Taoist temple. At this time, he was standing quietly beside her. Hearing her lament, he could not help but lament too. He whispered, "The great divine priest has been suffering from colds recently. He has been coughing badly and has a bad temper. Please do not take it to heart, priest. As for the Sword Garret, those who deserve to die will die." As the most powerful and terrifying great divine priest of the West Hill Divine Palace, he had already entered the knowing destiny state. He sat on the clouds and looked at the world as if he was an ant. Such a person had long been immune to all diseases. How could he catch a cold? How could he cough? If he didn't cough, how could he be grumpy? Yi Hongyu looked at the deacons of the judicial department who were looking at her mockingly and pitifully. She suddenly said sympathetically, "It is not easy to recover from being injured by the divine priest of light." The West Hill Divine Palace had a hierarch lord and 3 great divine priests. No matter if the person sitting on the great divine priest was old, sick, injured, or imprisoned, as long as he was alive, he would be the great divine priest worshipped by millions of people in the world. Sometime last year, the great divine priest of light, who had been imprisoned in the U prison for more than 10 years, rebelled and escaped. Then he died together with Master Yen Sei on a nameless mountain on the outskirts of Chang'an. There was an empty great divine priest of light in the West Hill Divine Palace. The great divine priest was waiting for someone else. The West Hill Divine Palace could not allow this situation to continue for too long. Therefore, when they knew that the great divine priest of light had left a successor in the world, the Divine Hall urgently needed to bring that successor back to the West Hill. This matter was still in a state of secrecy for the time being. If the people outside of the Divine Hall knew about this, they would probably have some doubts. Why did the people in the West Hill Divine Palace still choose the successor of the former Divine Priest of Light to take over the position of the Divine Priest of Light, even though he had betrayed the sect and brought great harm to the Divine Hall? But for the people in the West Hill Divine Palace, this matter was very natural. Because the great divine priest of light who rebelled was still the great divine priest of light. More importantly, for countless years, the inheritance of the 3 great divine priests of Peach Mountain had never been decided by the hierarch or the great divine priest, but by Haotian. The inheritance of the 3 great divine priests of Peach Mountain followed different paths. The inheritance of the great divine priest of judgment was a choice made by Haotian through the judgment of power. The inheritance of the great divine priest of revelation was a choice made by Haotian through the revelation of prophecy. The inheritance of the great divine priest of light was a choice made by Haotian through the continuation of light. The dying great divine priest of light found his successor in Chang'an. This must be the will of Haotian. Then that successor must be the future great divine priest of light. Especially after the news from the South Sea, the hierarch of the West Hill Divine Palace and the great divine priest of revelation became more and more confident. They did not hesitate to let the great divine priest of light wait for the return of its true master. In the old brush pen shop on Lin 47th Street, Ning Ke looked at Chang Lishue in front of him and kept silent for a long time. In the Right King's Palace of the Wilderness, he had once met the priest of the Revelation Department of the Divine Hall. In that dispute, Chang Lishua's calm and even fair performance left a good impression on him. But today, looking at the silver-white hair of Chang Lishua, he felt very uncomfortable. Because Chang Lishua was a bigwig in the West Hill Divine Palace, but his attitude was so sincere and even humble. Especially when Sang Sang served tea. Chang Lishua's respectful look made Ningke easily have an illusion that this guy was his and Song Song's future son. Ningke picked up the teacup on the table and thought for a moment. He said, I roughly understand the ins and outs of this matter, but I really can't promise you anything. Chang Lishua looked at him quietly and suddenly frowned. He said, although there have been some misunderstandings between the Divine Hall and the Academy these years, we still respect each other. Ningke said, I respect Haotian Taoism very much. Chang Lishua sighed and said, Junior Sister Sangsang will be the Divine Priest of Light of the Divine Hall in the future. Including me, hundreds of millions of Haotian believers in the world have to kneel in front of her and dare not speak or look at her. But Mr. 13, you let her make the bed and serve tea here. Then where is the respect for Haotian Taoism? My state has fallen, but I can't be weak. I'll write another chapter. The update time must be very late. I don't know when I can write it. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 409. Hearing this, Ningke looked at Sangsang, who was cooking in the backyard. After a moment of silence, he shook his head and said, To be honest, I still feel that the whole thing is ridiculous. I watched her grow from a little girl to a little girl. I know she has something special about her, but I didn't expect it to be so special that it could alarm the West Hill Divine Palace. Chang Lishua said, Even if younger sister Sangsang is an extremely ordinary person, she is no longer ordinary since Haotian chose her through the Divine Priest of Light, and we will definitely carry out Haotian's will and bring her back to the Divine Hall. I don't like to hear such words and tone. Ningke looked at the teacup in his hand and said after a moment of silence, Because it makes me feel that you are threatening me. It makes me feel that you are trying to take her away from me. Chang Lishua looked at him quietly and said, You can understand it from another perspective. Ningke took a sip of the cold tea and said mockingly, Since you are determined to bring her back, how can I understand it? If I don't agree, will you just give up? Chang Lishua shook his head. The Divine Priest of Light can't be without a leader all the time. Ningke put down the teacup and looked into his eyes. If I insist on not agreeing, what will the Divine Hall do? Chang Lishua heard the toughness in his words. After a moment of silence, he said with a smile, You should know what the Divine Priest of Light means to the entire Haotian Taoism and the West Hill Divine Palace. I'm not sure. Ningke still stared into his eyes and asked, Even at the cost of a war? Chang Lishua looked at him with a smile and said calmly, If the successor of the Divine Priest of Light is somewhere else in the world, the Divine Hall will find her even at the cost of the world's blood. Ningke said, Since you said it's somewhere else, then you and the bigwigs in the Divine Hall must know that Sangsang is now in Chang, and by my side. Chang Lishua said after a moment of silence, So I am here to ask younger sister Sangsang to go back? The word please sounds better. Ningke said, But I want to know how determined the Divine Hall is. Chang Lishua frowned slightly and said, Do you want to know if the Divine Hall will declare war on the Tang Empire because of this? Declare war on the Academy? Do you think the Tang Empire and the Academy will go to war with the Divine Hall because of junior sister Sangsang? Ningke thought of the bloodshed in Chang, and many years ago in General Xiaohou, who was still alive and well. After a long silence, he shook his head and said, The Empire and the Academy will not start a war with the Divine Hall over a little girl. But if you really want to take her away from me, I can tell you clearly that the Empire and the Academy will be involved in this war. Chang Lishua's face turned cold. It was not until now that he realized that junior sister Sangsang was not as simple as a handmaiden whom he had been with for many years. It was also until now that he realized that Ningke really had the determination and ruthlessness to let the world flood for junior sister Sangsang. Why should the Tang Empire and the Academy go to war with the Divine Hall because of your insolence? He sternly reprimanded. Are the headmaster of the Academy and the Emperor of the Tang Empire shameless people like you who would not hesitate to cause chaos in the world for your own selfish desires? Ningke's expression did not change. He looked at him and said, Don't forget who I am. If that day really comes, I have enough ways to drag the Academy and the Empire into this mess. There was silence in the old brush pin shop. Chang Lishua looked at him and said with a bitter smile, "Why can't you imagine it better? Junior sister Sang Sang is not going to the West Hill to be a prisoner or to suffer. On the contrary, she will receive the most perfect education from Haotian Taoism and become the most honorable divine priest of light on Peach Mountain. There is no harm in this for the Tang Empire, the Academy, or you. So why do we have to fight? Is it really because of his own selfish desires that he does not want Sang Sang to go to the West Hill Divine Palace, that he does not want Sang Sang to become the great divine priest of light, and that he wants her to serve him for the rest of her life?" Ning Ke looked at the remaining tea in the cup and fell into a long silence. Then he suddenly raised his head and said, "Let me think about it." Chang Lishua looked into his eyes and said seriously, "The great divine priest of revelation cannot stay in Chang, and for long. I hope you can think about it seriously and not use it as an excuse to fool me." That night, Ning Ke brought Sang Sang to the Grand Secretary's mansion. Mrs. Zhang was overjoyed to see her daughter, whom she had not seen for a few days. She held her daughter's hand and walked into the backyard, leaving the quiet study room to Ning Ke and the Grand Secretary. "What are your thoughts on this matter, my lord?" Ning Ke asked seriously. He wanted to find some spiritual support from her expression, such as a parent's reluctance to part with their daughter, but in the next moment, he realized that it was just wishful thinking. Grand Secretary Zhang Jing's face showed some reluctance, but he was more excited and at a loss after the extreme surprise. For the believers of Haotian in the world, even if they were citizens of the Tang Empire, it would be a great honor to suddenly find out that their daughter could become the great divine priest of light of the West Hill Divine Palace. "I'm thinking if I should go back to my hometown and rebuild the ancestral hall. If it weren't for the blessings of my ancestors in heaven, how could my family have such a grand event?" Speaking of rebuilding the ancestral hall, even the rules have to be changed. Although there are no clear rules in the laws of the Tang Empire, according to the old rules set by the great divine priest of West Hill from the Chui family of Qinghe Prefecture more than 100 years ago, the ancestral hall of the Zhang family can be compared to the rules set by the princes. Grand Secretary Zhang Jing's face was full of joy, and he said in a trembling voice, "This is still within the territory of the Tang Empire, where the imperial power is supreme. If it were in the South Jin Kingdom or the Kingdom of Song, we could even rebuild the ancestral hall according to the imperial system. Mr. 13, how could I be so lucky?" Suddenly, he noticed Ning Ke's silence, and he smiled embarrassedly and said, I forgot myself. But at least I am better than the clan leader of the Chui family of Qinghe Prefecture. It is said that when the news of the West Hill choosing the great divine priest reached Qinghe Prefecture, the clan leader was so surprised that he became a fool. Ning Ke smiled bitterly and said, "Is it really that good to be the great divine priest of West Hill?" Zhang Jing was stunned, and his face was full of surprise. He thought that as a core disciple of the headmaster of academy, how could he ask such an absurd and even retarded question? For the people of the world, being the great divine priest of West Hill was more perfect than being an emperor. If this was not good, then what other good things could there be in the world? Zhang Jing suddenly came to his senses, and he looked at him in disbelief and said, "You don't want Sang Sang to go to West Hill?" Ning Ke was silent for a long time, and then he said, "It's not that I don't want to, it's just that I haven't thought about it yet." Zhang Jing said in a trembling voice, "Mr. 13, you saved my daughter from a difficult situation and have taken good care of her all these years. I am very grateful for that. I also know that the relationship between you and my daughter is not an ordinary master and servant. However, please consider this matter carefully and don't make a rash decision." Ning Ke did not say anything. Zhang Jing thought of a possibility, but he felt that it was unlikely. He tugged at his beard and hesitated for a long time, and then he lowered his voice and said tentatively, "I heard that the canon does not allow the great divine priest to marry. Ning Ke suddenly raised his head and looked at him, asking, "Really?" Zhang Jing looked at Ning Ke's eyes that suddenly brightened, and he was startled, thinking that his wife's guess was true? Thinking that his guess might be true, Zhang Jing suddenly forgot that Ning Ke was a student of the second floor of the academy, and subconsciously put on the airs of an elder. He stroked his beard and frowned, asking, If Sang Sang doesn't go to West Hill, how will Mr. 13 arrange for my poor daughter in the future? Ning Ke did not notice the change in his expression, and said, I will marry her when she is over 16. Zhang Jing's fingers that were stroking his beard trembled, and 3 strands of beard fell off. He was waiting for Ning Ke to speak, and then he would argue with him. But he did not expect that Ning Ke would say that he would marry Sang Sang without any hesitation or concealment. Wife? Zhang Jing asked in a trembling voice. Ning Ke shook his head. Zhang Jing was slightly angry. Ning Ke shook his head and said, Of course it's a wife. How can it be a crooked one? Zhang Jing relaxed a lot, and asked with a smile, Will you take a concubine? Ning Ke said bitterly, I want to, but do you think it's possible? Zhang Jing's smile grew wider. His daughter might marry the core disciple of the headmaster of academy, and Ning Ke had promised not to take a concubine. With such a future, it would not be a pity if he did not become the great divine priest of West Hill. In that case, it's up to you whether Sang Sang goes to West Hill or not. Zhang Jing, the Grand Secretary, had always been a very decisive person. Otherwise, he would not have directly divorced his wife and killed her servant after Sang Sang was killed by his wife, even with the pressure from the Empress. Therefore, after hearing Ning Ke's words and thinking about the pros and cons of the 2 choices, he did not hesitate to remove himself and his wife from this matter, and put all the pressure on Ning Quebec. Ning Ke said painfully, Shouldn't we discuss this kind of thing? Zhang Jing stroked his slightly painful chin, and said while shaking his head, Sang Sang is still in Mr. Ning's household register, and you two have a deep relationship. In terms of emotion and reason, Mr. Ning should also make the decision. Ning Ke suddenly realized that his future father-in-law was not someone who could be easily fooled. Zhang Jing looked at him and sneered. Don't think that you can fool me and refuse the request of the West Hill Divine Palace just because you are a student of the 2nd floor of the academy. The night was getting late. Mrs. Zhang walked out of the backyard with Sang Sang, and her face was full of reluctance. Zhang Jing pulled his wife aside and whispered a few words to her. Mrs. Zhang covered her mouth and was slightly shocked. When she looked at Ning Ke again, the look in her eyes was very different from before, and it was extremely loving. I thought that Mr. Ning would come often in the future, so I ordered someone to prepare a guest room in the backyard. Mrs. Zhang looked at Ning Ke and said with a smile, Why don't you rest here tonight? Ning Ke suddenly felt that he had walked into the world of strange stories, and he had the urge to run away. I have an urgent matter to attend to later. He stood up and asked Sang Sang to spend more time with his parents in the Grand Secretary's mansion, and then he left. He went to the 2nd street of Spring Breeze Pavilion. Chao Xiaoshu's house was on this street. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Qidian.com to vote for it. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 4:10. Chi 4 had been waiting outside the Chao mansion. Seeing that Ning Ke had finally appeared, he let out a sigh of relief and led him into the mansion, whispering the latest situation along the way. It was already late at night, but the hall of the Chao mansion was still brightly lit. Several people sat silently in the hall, and the atmosphere was somewhat depressing. When they looked at the old master sitting at the head of the table, they would always have a gentle smile on their faces, but the smile seemed a little forced. Chi 4 led Ning Ke into the hall. Everyone stood up, cupped their fists, bowed and introduced themselves. Chong San, Chong Siwei. Lu Wu Lu Si. Fei Lu, Fei Jingwei. Chun 7. The people in the Chao mansion today were all former leaders of the Fish Dragon gang. After the Spring Breeze Pavilion case, their identities were exposed, and they could only leave the Fish Dragon gang and return to the imperial court. Now they had important positions in the Valiant Cavalry Battalion and the Bodyguard Office. Everyone was gathered here for that matter. Before Chao Xiaoshu left Chang'an, he had specially brought his brothers to Lin 47th Street to let Ning Ke meet them. Ning Ke knew the identity of these people. From the perspective of the secret guards, they were considered colleagues, so it was not strange for them to appear here. Chong San and the others looked at Ning Ke with a complicated expression. Before Chao Xiaoshu left, He had vaguely intended to entrust them and the fish dragon gang to Ning Ke. But Ning Ke did not accept. They had always been puzzled about this, and did not understand why Cao Xiaoshu trusted him so much. However, 2 years had passed in a flash, and Ning Ke had long become a celebrity in Chang'an. Only then did they realize that second brother Cao had long seen through this man's extraordinary abilities. "This is Old Master Cao," Chi For introduced. Ning Ke looked at the white-haired old man, who had a worried expression on his face. For some reason he felt a little annoyed. He frowned and said, he should not travel far with his parents around, but he does travel happily and freely. Old Master Cao sighed and explained for his son, "In the beginning, I wanted him to take the scholarly exams, and then I wanted him to seek an official position. I've restrained him for half his life. Now that he finally has a chance to get rid of all this, let him go." Ning Ke was slightly taken aback. He did not expect Old Master Cao to be so open-minded. He also thought about how Cao Xiaoshu had been the emperor of the underworld in Chang, and for many years. Old Master Cao, who came from a family of scholars, did not care about him at all. He thought that Old Master Cao was a smart person who had ideas but was not good at giving them. After figuring this out, he no longer had to hide from the old man. He looked at the people around him and said, "I have interrogated the South Jin Kingdom sword master. Second brother Cao must have fought with Liu Bai." There was a burst of exclamations in the hall. Chang Siwei's face was full of worry. They had gone through thick and thin with Cao Xiaoshu for many years and had a kind of almost foolish confidence in him. However, when they heard that the person who attacked was really the Sage of Sword, Liu Bai, they could not help but feel shocked and at a loss. The sage was the most powerful man in the world. Of Cao Xiaoshu. And was and how? Of Cao. Of. Sich Ning Ke said. Lu Yiqing doesn't know the exact result of that battle. Cao Xiaoshu's sword was taken away, so he must have been seriously injured. But we don't know where he is now. Chi For scratched his head and said in a distressed tone, with second brother Chao's personality, he definitely wouldn't do something so stupid. What we need to confirm now is how serious his injuries are. Is he hiding in a small village or is he imprisoned by the South Jin Kingdom? Not in the sword pavilion. Ning Ke looked at the crowd and said, Lu Yiqing would not dare to lie about this, because the academy will keep him imprisoned until we find Cao Xiaoshu. Besides, the academy has already sent a letter to the sword garret to ask Liu Bai. Although the people present used to be famous in the underworld of Chang, and were now important figures in the imperial court, they did not know much about the world of cultivators and did not know how to deal with it. When they heard Ning Ke's words and knew that the academy would personally come forward, they immediately felt relieved. Chang San added, His Majesty also knows about this. Tomorrow, he will write an official letter to the king of the South Jin Kingdom to ask for Cao Xiaoshu. I think the people of the South Jin Kingdom will consider it carefully. Chan 7 had been standing silently in the corner, hiding behind the crowd. It seemed that he was not used to being seen by so many people. Suddenly he said, I think there is something wrong with this. Everyone looked at him, including Ning Quebec. Ning Ke had noticed that when everyone introduced themselves, only Chan 7 did not. At the same time he remembered the description of the Fish Dragon Gang in Chang, and's Jianghu world. Chang 3 was cold, Chi 4 was ruthless, Lu V was vicious, Fei 6 was vicious, and Chan 7 was sinister. How sinister was Chan 7? The Sage of Sword Liu Bai attacked second brother Cao probably because he was eager to hunt, or because he wanted to suppress the Tang Empire's momentum, or because second brother Cao ate a grain from the sword garret. Chan 7 lowered his head and spoke slowly as if he could not feel the crowd's gaze. Although what he said was funny, his voice was as gloomy as a mouse in the shadows. That is not important. The important thing is, why did Lu Yiqing challenge the academy? Why did he take second brother Chao's sword? And why did he want everyone to know about this? I am not a cultivator, and I don't know what cultivators usually think. But I think that if cultivators are still human, then their way of thinking is no different from us ordinary people. Ning Ke nodded and said, I can prove that. Chan 7 slowly raised his head, and his small eyes shone with a dim light. Lu Bai is the most powerful man in the world, so he cannot be an idiot. It is possible for him to send his own brother to humiliate the academy. Even if he loses, he can use the academy to sharpen his brother's cultivation. It is also possible for him to punish second brother Chao, and you for the disciple who died in the hands of the two of you in Spring Breeze Pavilion 2 years ago. But I don't think he will think that it is feasible to take second brother Chao's sword and make you think that second brother Chao is dead, so that his own brother will become blind. Ning Ke was silent. He recalled the battle at the side gate of the academy, and confirmed that what Chan 7 said made sense. If he had not seen Chao Xiaoshu's sword in Lu Yiqing's hand, he would not have chosen to attack so fiercely. It was not good for him to blind the Sage of Sword, Lu Bai's brother. If I were Lu Bai, I would first defeat second brother Chao, who had entered the knowing destiny state, and then let my brother defeat Ning Quebec. That would be enough to make up for what happened in Spring Breeze Pavilion. There is no need for me to make the Academy and the Tang Empire a mortal enemy. Chan 7 continued softly, according to the intelligence of the bodyguard office, when you entered the second floor of the Academy, your name immediately spread throughout the cultivation world. Even though we are not cultivators, we all know that your name is in the tomes of Arcane, and many details of the Spring Breeze Pavilion case have also been spread. The natural speed of transmission of information is definitely not that fast. At that time there was already someone behind the scenes adding fuel to the fire. They wanted the Sword Garret of South Jin Kingdom to focus on second brother Chao and you. Then I believe that there was also someone behind these two incidents. Lu Yiqing holding second brother Chao's sword is one of them. Chan 7 looked at everyone calmly and said, there is only one place in the world that has the ability and courage to provoke the relationship between the Tang Academy and the Sword Garret of South Jin Kingdom, and also has the right to benefit from this matter. That is the West Hill Divine Palace. Outside the capital of South Jin Kingdom, there was an ancient black and white pavilion on the cliff. It was called the Sword Garret. The building of the Sword Garret led into the cliff. It was a big quiet cave. The top of the cave reached the peak and sunlight shone through. At the bottom of the cave, there was a green pond and a thatched hut. It was like a small world of its own. Lu Bai sat in his own small world and looked at the fine bubbles spurting out by the blind fish in the green pond. He slowly reached out and pushed his long hair behind his back. He asked indifferently, who can give me an explanation? The news of Lu Yiqing's defeat in the academy and his blindness had already spread to the South Jin Kingdom. Along with this news came 2 letters from the Tang Empire. One of the letters was written by the Tang Emperor himself, and it was now in the bedchamber of the king of South Jin Kingdom. The king was extremely angry, but also extremely helpless. The other letter was written by an old woman in the academy. It was now quietly placed beside Lu Bai's legs. The seal had been cut, and he had probably already read it. Beside the green pond, more than 10 important second-generation disciples of the Sword Garret knelt. When they heard their master's question, they lowered their heads in silence and did not know how to answer. Lu Yiqing had been defeated in a direct challenge. How could they explain this? Lu Bai looked at the green pond in front of him and said expressionlessly, my own brother has become a blind man. Who can give me an explanation for this? A disciple of the Sword Garret said indignantly, the academy is too ruthless. We must what? Revenge? Why do we need revenge? Lu Bai said coldly, swordsmanship is about the spirit and boldness of advancing forward. Since I wanted him to defeat and kill Ning Ke, then it was natural that he would be defeated and killed by Ning Quebec. Moreover, I wanted him to go to the academy to seek defeat so that he could cleanse his sword heart. The disciples were shocked speechless. Only then did they realize that their master had already expected Lu Yiqing to lose. Lu Bai glanced at the letter beside him and said in a cold voice, I just don't understand. I asked Yiqing to cleanse his own sword. But why did he bring Chao Xiaoshu's sword? Everything about the Sage of Sword Lu Bai was a sword, whether it was his loose black hair, the belt around his waist, the slightly swaying sleeves, his eyes, his back view or his voice. When his voice became colder, the disciples of the Sword Garret beside the pond seemed to see a divine sword slowly being pulled out of the ice. Their eyes were pierced by the sharp sword style and they began to tear up immediately. The disciples were terrified and kneeled on the ground, trembling and not daring to say a word. Lu Bai slowly turned around and looked at the disciples beside the pond coldly. He said, "My brother is an idiot in everything except swordsmanship." Because of his idiocy, he didn't even think of a way to provoke Ning Ke with Chao Xiaoshu's sword. Then who helped him think of it? There was dead silence in the cliff cave behind the sword garret. After a long time, one of the disciples who was kneeling beside the pond slowly straightened up. Then he stood up and took 2 steps towards the pond. He bowed deeply but did not speak. Lu Bai looked at this disciple and said coldly, "Is the judicial department better than the sword garret? There is one more chapter. It was written before 1130. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation." Chapter 4:11. The blind fish in the little green pond were still spitting bubbles. The yellow grass by the pond was still yellow and weak. They were like the companions in the hut. Hearing Lu Bai's question, the disciple who walked to the pond was shocked. He had decided to confess everything, but he did not expect that his master had already known his true identity. Lu Bai said, "I have raised you and taught you for 7 years. You can even keep a cold sword warm. I did not expect that the judicial department was born to be a block of ice." The sword garret disciple was silent for a long time before he bowed again and sincerely apologized. "I'm sorry. I didn't expect that it would end up like this." Lu Bai said expressionlessly, "If the judicial department wants to borrow the sword of the sword garret to kill someone, they should tell me in advance. Taking without asking is not borrowing but stealing." The disciple sighed and said, "It is my duty. I do not want to do this." "I know you do not want to do this," Lu Bai repeated tiredly. The disciple slowly straightened his body and calmly looked at Lu Bai across the pond. The fact that he could withstand the fierce sword style from Lu Bai showed that his real cultivation state was much higher than usual. Of course, even if his cultivation state was several levels higher, he would still not be a match for Lu Bai. But there was no fear on his face. The sage of sword Lu Bai was the most powerful man in the world. He was feared by countless cultivators. But he was a deacon of the West Hill Divine Palace. His orders came from the Black Taoist Temple in Peach Mountain. In Lu Bai's words, he borrowed Chao Xiaoshu's sword by virtue of his authority to manage the sword garret. Then he lent it to Lu Yiqing, who was about to go to Chang'an, and said a few words to him. Taking without asking was indeed not borrowing, but stealing. But since the West Hill Divine Palace wanted to borrow the sword to kill someone, then borrowing was borrowing. Even if it was stealing in the eyes of the world, it was still borrowing. After all, Lu Bai was a visiting professor of West Hill. He had to follow Hao Yan's orders. What could he do to him? Whether Prince Longqing is dead or alive, I think he is ruined. Lu Bai looked at him and said. The disciple replied respectfully, "Yes." Lu Bai said again, "I heard that Yi Hongyu was also ruined after coming back from the wilderness." The disciple said calmly, "Yes." Lu Bai laughed and said, "Will you take over the position of Grand Master after returning to Peach Mountain?" That disciple also laughed, using silence to express his acknowledgement. Lu Bai smiled even more happily and said, "Doesn't that mean you can become the great divine priest of judgment in the future?" The disciple smiled without saying a word. The smile on Lu Bai's face suddenly disappeared. He looked at the disciple and said expressionlessly, "Although it is my honor as a teacher that a disciple of the sword garret can inherit the position of great divine priest, I suddenly thought of something. If you really become the great divine priest of judgment, it will be inconvenient for me to kill you." The disciple's body stiffened as he looked at the other side of the pond. "Since you are not the great divine priest of judgment, then you have to pay a price for stealing." The disciple's expression suddenly turned cold. He wanted to say something, but he found that there was a hint of sweetness in his mouth. There was something soft and slippery between his teeth. Then he realized that it was his own tongue. Immediately after, His head was severed from his neck and fell to the ground beside the pond. It rolled around and rolled into the green pond. A moment later, a few streaks of blood appeared in the pond. The blind fish smelled the taste of its food and began to spit bubbles more cheerfully. The disciples of the sword Garrett who had been silently kneeling beside the pond came up and began to clean up the headless corpse. They noticed that the neck cavity was smooth and bloodless, and the fracture seemed to be covered by a transparent film. They could clearly see the trachea, esophagus, bones, and blood. They felt a little disgusted. To Lu Bai, killing an important figure of the judicial department of the Divine Hall was as easy as killing a mouse. His expression did not change at all. However, when his gaze landed on the letter from the academy, his brows gradually furrowed. Find Cao Xiaoshu and send him safely back to Chang'an City. Exchange for my brother. The disciples of the sword Garrett looked at each other and left with the order. At this time, a middle-aged man walked in from outside. He looked at the floating blood bubbles in the green pond and sighed softly. He walked behind Lu Bai and asked respectfully, "Senior brother, has the problem been solved?" Lu Bai said, "If killing could solve the problem, then the world would be much better in my eyes." The middle-aged man said bitterly, "I heard that the great divine priest of judgment valued him very much. This time he really wanted him to go back to Peach Mountain to take over Yi Hongyu's position. Senior brother, you could have cut off one of his hands. Why did you have to kill him?" After a moment of silence, Lu Bai said, "Bring me a pen and paper." Sunlight poured down from the entrance of the cave on the peak and condensed into a beam that shrouded the green pond, the hut, and the person beside the pond. Lu Bai sat beside the pond under the sunlight and thought for a long time. Then he picked up the pen and paper beside him and slowly and casually scribbled on the yellowish paper. He was not writing, he was drawing. The soft ink pen walked on the paper that could not be spread flat. The lines were twisted and knotted and trembled from time to time. A few simple strokes formed a hollow, long and narrow object with difficulty, but it could not be seen what it was. The format was very clumsy, and it looked like the work of a naughty child. However, such a clumsy and simple painting seemed to exhaust Lu Bai's energy. Under the reflection of the water, his cheeks looked a little pale and haggard. The middle-aged man glanced at the painting and his body suddenly stiffened. "Can you tell what I drew?" Lu Bai asked. After a moment of silence, the middle-aged man said in a slightly hoarse voice, "Senior brother, you drew a sword." Lu Bai said with satisfaction, "You can tell that it is a sword. Junior brother, it seems that your state has improved." The middle-aged man forcibly suppressed his shock and asked, "Senior brother, who are you going to give this sword to?" Lu Bai said calmly, "To West Hill, to Yi Hong." The middle-aged man could no longer control his emotions. He knelt behind Lu Bai and said in a trembling voice, "Senior brother, why did you do this? Why did you send it to the Tao addict?" Lu Bai looked at the paper in his hand and said, "Because after the divine priest of light died in Chang, and only this woman in the whole Peach Mountain still made me admire her. But the sword Garrett and the judicial department have broken up." The middle-aged man said anxiously in a trembling voice, "If Yi Hongyu really understood your sword style, won't she become a great enemy of the sword Garrett in the future?" Lu Bai said, "Even without my sword, the Tao addict can still cross the threshold again. I just hope that she can do it faster." He raised his head and looked at the sunlight falling on the peak. He said expressionlessly, "The old judge lent a sword to I Ching, so I will lend a sword to Yi Hong." The purpose of lending a sword was to kill. In a remote stone house in the Peach Mountain of West Hill. "Priest, I am just a messenger. Please don't take it to heart." Chan Bachi looked at Yi Hongyu in front of him. His eyes flickered on the loose green Taoist robe on her, and then fell on her beautiful and charming face again. He used to be the commander of the cavalrymen of Divine Hall. Although he was forced by Ning Ke to accept the punishment of the Black Ink Garden disciples when they encountered the horse gang, he was beaten with thorns and stripped of all his duties. But he still had the strength of the upper see-through state, so he still had a high status in the judicial department. In the past, his direct superior was Prince Long Qing, but the person he truly feared was Yi Hongyu in front of him. Even if Yi Hongyu was in such dire straits now, he still felt a little difficult to breathe in front of her. He naturally used the old title and spoke very carefully. But after all, things were changing. Everyone in the divine hall knew that the great divine priest of judgment had suspended Yi Hongyu from her duties as the priest and asked her to meditate and reflect. Perhaps because of the influence of this matter, Chan Bachi's eyes became more presumptuous than before. While Yi Hongyu was calmly looking out of the house, his eyes moved back and forth on her beautiful cheeks and body. The reason why Yi Hongyu, Mo Shanshan and Lu Qinjiao were called the three addicts of the world was not only because of their high cultivation states, but also because they were all very beautiful. Yi Hongyu had always been very beautiful. Her figure had always been very good and very attractive. Now, her delicate and alluring body was shrouded in a wide green Taoist robe. However, Chan Bachi had seen too many images of her wearing a red short skirt. At this moment, the wide green Taoist robe seemed to have disappeared, revealing a pair of straight, tight, and smooth thighs. The young girl was still beautiful and attractive, and because of her current gloomy situation, her timidity made her beauty more real, making some people have the courage to possess this beauty. Chan Bachi's eyes were a little obscene, but he did not dare to do so in his heart, because he did not have the courage. It had nothing to do with the majestic memories of the Tao addict in his heart, but related to what he was going to say today. Lord Luo Kadi is the commander of the Divine Guards and the trusted aide of the Hierarch Lord. You should be very clear about his cultivation state, priest. If he is willing to participate in the fight for the Divine Priest of Judgment, the chances of winning are very high. Seeing Yi Hongyu turn around, Chan Bachi respectfully bowed and said, "If priest thinks this is feasible, the commander will personally come to express his affection and determination to you." He also said that as long as you agree, he will immediately go to the Hierarch Lord to propose marriage. Yi Hongyu looked at the seemingly respectful old subordinate in front of her, and was silent for a long time. Then she calmly said, "Give me some time to think about it." Chan Bachi said repeatedly, "Of course, of course." Yi Hongyu slowly closed the door of the stone house and then sat back on the stone bed shrouded in darkness. For a Haotian Taoism woman who had almost nothing left but her face and body, a dignified commander of the Divine Guards coming to propose marriage was not only of course, but also a surprise. Her expression was still calm, but her body under the loose green Taoist robe could not help but tremble. The stone bed made a squeaking sound, as if it would collapse at any time. The more I write about Yi Hongyu, the more I like her. I have decided not to let her fall in love, marry, and be alone for the rest of her life. Is this the so-called possessiveness? See you all tomorrow. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 412. In the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine in the Wilderness, Lotus not only polluted her flesh and blood, but also her state of mind. Her originally clear Taoist heart was covered with dust because of something in the past. Moreover, because her knowing destiny state was not stable, there was no possibility for her to recover after she forcefully lowered her state. If she was an ordinary cultivator, she would have given up in despair when encountering such a setback. But she was not an ordinary cultivator. She was a Tao addict who was obsessed with Taoism. She was very clear that all setbacks were tests from Haotian. As long as her Taoist heart was strong enough, she could turn all of these into the most beautiful scenery on the long road of cultivation. In the wilderness, she had seen the stone array tactics set by the divine priest of light 1,000 years ago. She had seen Mr. Kazharan's sword that split the heaven and earth. These scenery were silently waiting for her to admire and absorb. But other people in the West Hill Divine Palace did not know. The great divine priest of judgment did not know. Luo Kadi, the commander of the Divine Guards who wanted to force her to marry, did not know. The result of not knowing was that the West Hill Divine Palace not only treated her with indifference, mockery, contempt and humiliation, but also deprived her of the time she needed the most. Yi Hongyu needed time. Time to see through the scenery and see through the paper covering her eyes, so she could calmly ignore those complicated gazes and those harsh words. She could appear timid and even humble. She could kneel in front of the divine priest and respectfully act as if she was a hopeless waste. However, the situation she was facing now had suddenly become difficult. Although the commander of the divine guards, Luo Kadi, was a rare master in the divine hall and the most trusted subordinate of the hierarch, Yi Hongyu would never consider marrying him. Not because of his age, not because of his appearance, not even because she had no feelings for him. Because for the sake of cultivation, she could not have any feelings. But because he wanted her to marry him. He wanted her to marry him, not he begged her to marry him, not he asked her to marry him. This was a humiliation she could not accept. Yi Hongyu silently sat on the stone bed, her hands clutching the green Taoist robe so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Do I really have to go back to the temple? Chun Pippi, you damn fatty, you bitch, you idiot. I only scared you when you were young. Why did you run away? Why don't you go back to the temple now? If you don't go back, my brother won't forgive me. How can I go back? Perhaps it was because she thought of Chun Pippi, the hateful guy, or because of her brother. Yi Hongyu could no longer control her emotions. She lowered her head silently, and her eyes were full of grievance, sadness, and timidity. At this time she was no longer the Tao addict or a loser. She was just a very ordinary girl. When an ordinary girl was forced to marry, she would naturally get angry easily. Hence, Yi Hongyu became very angry at this moment. She looked coldly at the closed door of the stone house and thought that she should kill Chonbachi, Luo Kadi, and everyone who dared to look at her like that. However, the anger in her eyes gradually turned into frustration and self-mockery because she had no more time. She could not return to the temple. It seemed that she could only angrily and helplessly sit by the stone bed. At this moment, someone arrived outside the stone house. Sir, there's a letter for you. The person outside the stone house did not call her a priest. He did not deliberately show respect, but such a simple sentence showed enough respect. This was the respect that only she could feel. Yi Hongyu raised her eyebrows slightly, and her expression changed slightly. In the divine hall, she had not been so respected for a long time. The door of the stone house opened. She recognized that the person was a very ordinary deacon of the judicial department. The deacon respectfully handed over a letter with both hands. Then, without saying anything, he turned and left the stone house. The door of the stone house closed again, and darkness reappeared. Yi Hongyu walked back to the stone bed and sat down. She quietly looked at the letter in her hand and did not speak for a long time. The envelope was made of ordinary craft paper. There was nothing special about it, and there was no writing on the cover. She used to be the Grand Master of the Judicial Department. Although she did not manage the specific affairs of the department, she still had a pair of eyes that could see through all the details in the world and find clues from them. The seemingly ordinary craft paper was the most common craft in the paper workshop in Danzhou. Then this letter came from the South Jin Kingdom. Yi Hongyu was sure that she did not know anyone in the South Jin Kingdom, so she did not know who the writer was. She opened the envelope, took out the letter inside and slowly unfolded it. The letter was made of yellowish papyrus. There was a pattern drawn on the papyrus. The person who drew the picture was obviously not good at painting. The lines were crooked and trembling. It was extremely ugly and clumsy. It was impossible to understand what he drew. Yi Hongyu looked at the long and narrow hollow pattern on the yellowish paper. Her fingers, which were holding the two corners of the paper, trembled slightly. She did not speak for a long time. She understood what was drawn on the paper. It was a sword. The sword of the Sage of Sword Lu Bai. The kingdom of Yu was south of the South Jin Kingdom and east of the Great River. It faced the relatively quiet South Sea, so the fishing port was much more prosperous and lively than the one in the Kingdom of Song. A young man in a cotton shirt walked out of a fishing boat. He stretched towards the sun and then squinted his eyes, signaling his subordinates to complete the following tasks. This young man's appearance was exceptionally handsome. The severe scar on his cheek didn't make his face appear sinister. Instead, it made him look more composed. He squinted at the red rising sun and felt the wet sea breeze on his cheeks. Suddenly, he felt an unprecedented satisfaction. He said in a low voice, It doesn't seem bad to live like this for the rest of my life. The young man's subordinates were arguing fiercely with the fish and salt merchants. But these things seemed to have nothing to do with him. He just looked at the sun in silence. The people in the fishing port only knew that this young man was a big merchant from the north. He was in the salted fish business. No one knew what kind of dazzling life this young man had before he started selling salted fish, and what kind of reputation he had in the world. The young man used to be a prince of the Yin kingdom. He was the most famous young powerhouse in the West Hill Divine Palace. He was a brilliant and beautiful man who had planted several peach blossoms on the threshold of the knowing destiny state. But now he was a merchant selling fish. Even though he had been shot in the chest by Ning Ke and his cultivation state was destroyed, even though he had abandoned himself to fight for food with the beggars in the broken temple, he was still Prince Long Qing. Without cultivation state, he still had his fists. Even if his fists could not resist the wind and rain of the world, he still had his wisdom. Most importantly, since he was not dead, he wanted to live a better life. In half a month, he unified the beggar gang inside and outside the capital of the Yin Kingdom and became the gang leader. Then, he took a part of the gang's wealth and some loyal subordinates to the Song Kingdom. He opened a wine shop and defeated all his peers on the street in a short time. Then, he sold those wine shops, tea houses, and restaurants to an official of the Song Kingdom at half price. With 1,000 taels of silver, he started a peddling business. He bought salted fish from the Yu Kingdom and sold them to the South Jin Kingdom, or the Yin Kingdom. The business was good. Sometimes Long Qing could not help but sigh. It seemed that he could do everything well. In such a short time, he had become a big merchant. What was there to be dissatisfied with? However, looking at the salted fish in the bamboo basket, he could not help but think, even if he became the richest merchant in the world, what was the difference between him and the salted fish in the basket? I am in an extremely bad state today. I have a problem with my emotions. This is the only chapter. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. You're tuning in to the Li Mei Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.